Hello, and welcome back to today's Kyoto Animation Review Show. I'm Octo, and I'll be your post-mortem host for the momentously unceremonious re-upload extravaganza that is to follow, i.e., this video. Before anything else, I'd like to offer an apology for my audio quality during these new segments. It's a little different from the norm for me, by which I mean that it isn't as good because I didn't ask to borrow Connor's microphone to record this stuff. The reason I'm here is because I feel the original version of this video lacked sufficient external context to be properly understood for what it was, and also because I wanted to give some extra insight into how it was made and what the goal of making it was, which I feel will be beneficial both to those of you who are just now joining the KYOTO Anime Show bandless four-wheeled transportation device, and especially to those of you who saw the original version and were a little confused by it. I should start by mentioning that this video is nothing like the Nichijou video, but that it is meant to be sort of a sequel to it. That's why I didn't bother explaining myself in the original upload, and why I so adamantly insisted that anybody who show up here first watch the Nichijou review and then come back. Assuming people would actually respect the watch order and do that was a mistake on my part that I fully plan to rectify here, partially by making access to this video a secret that only those who really want to watch it will be able to go out of their way to find, and also partially by just not caring as much what you do. TLDR, if you watched episode 1, this video is a really good way to follow up that journey, and to a lesser extent you might consider it a follow-up to a video I made about Angel's Egg, so please consider watching that video too for full personal and creative context, but if you just want to start here, that's fine. That's the whole reason for the post-mortem content. Part of the problem with the original upload was me intentionally provoking people who did not watch the Nichijou video first, and so in acknowledgement of your time, I'm just going to say that I'm glad you chose to spend it watching one of my videos. And I'm not going to give you too much of a hard time for not being up to date on the full Octo's Corner deep lore before watching this one. I also wanted to wait until the Haruhi video was out before putting this back up on the internet and kind of hide it away in the description of that one. Unless of course you're here early for some reason, in which case hi, enjoy seeing this early. The reason for that is because I figured this video is so aggressively against being about Hyouka itself that I wanted to make sure that it was out there in conjunction with something more traditionally review-oriented, so that it was obvious that this is a more experimental and one-off style of video, and that it's not indicative of what the Kyoto Animation review series is as a whole, if that makes sense. Now that being said, I do think I did a good job of reviewing Hyouka itself in some ways, and really the goal from the beginning was to kind of illustrate for you what it feels like to learn to like a show, or I guess to go into a show without having any sort of prior idea what it might mean to you or what you might think about it. In that sense, you might consider this to be a review of what it's like to have a love-hate relationship with Hyouka. And I'm telling you now that this is expressly not for you if you are already a big Hyouka fan. If it's for anyone, aside from myself, of course, I'd say that this is a video for writers who aren't confident in themselves, people who have regrets that they haven't learned to deal with yet, and people who expressly dislike Hyouka. I was with you. I didn't like Hyouka at first either. I also want it known, however, that I did not force myself to like it for the sake of this review. That's why I think the review itself is interesting, and that's the biggest thing that I want to update about it. For this beginning segment, I had only seen about 14 episodes of Hyouka before writing it. My younger brother and I attempted to watch it together, and we really pushed to try to finish it back when I first got gifted the show, but we just could not get through it. And that's the context under which I wrote this opening segment, which, again, I intentionally wrote this section before rewatching Hyouka for this video, and before reading the books, so keep that in mind as you watch this first bit. There's a weird kind of stigma around Hyouka that we'll be going into in a bit more detail about later on, and that I really wanted to explore here, but for now just know that if you're not already a fan of Hyouka, that the fanbase has been in a rut since about 2016 or so. Like, it has stagnated. And that's not really the case for a lot of other KyoAni works, which have ended up being a bit more evergreen. Now that being said, I'll take my leave of you now, and we'll meet back up here before the next chapter begins. Good afternoon, and welcome back to Kyou no Kyoto Anime Show, today's Kyoto Animation Review Show. I'm your host, Octo, and I'm here today in my former college's student library, irrespective of all other students here, and of the rules forbidding non-student personnel to enter the premises, to present to you, my dear viewer, my review and not review of Kyoto Animation's 22-episode 2012 slice-of-life anime series, Hyouka, which we might translate to English as ice cream or shaved ice. Ice Cream or Shaved Ice is a slow-burn mystery series in which a group of teenagers and one very disinterested teenager solve otherwise irrelevant and largely ignored micro-mysteries at a largely non-germane, ordinary educational establishment. As a result, I've chosen to film various segments of this review at an actual school library and solve an actual school mystery, a decision for which I did not receive permission, and which may result in complications down the line if I am not extraordinarily careful about how I go about it. I'll also be making use of the woefully underused Octo's Corner film set, which previous viewers will recall was painstakingly put together only to result in the realization that I am not yet comfortable showing my face on camera. If you'd like to know more about this series and its approach to actually reviewing its subject matter, you should probably have watched the first episode before clicking on this one. However, you can still rectify this mistake if you'd like by paying a visit to whatever random part of the internet the lowercase I in that corner leads to, and then by watching Nichijou, an ordinary review, at your earliest convenience. As for those of you who didn't skip here and who did watch episode 1, your presence, as always, is both welcome and greatly appreciated. I can't see anything from here because there's currently a giant octopus drawing in front of my face, but nonetheless, it's good to see you. You are permitted to enjoy a snack or beverage of your choice here in the library, just so long as you make sure to keep things relatively quiet so as not to disturb the other students here. Hyouka, Ice Cream or Shaved Ice, was chosen as the subject of this review even in advance of the release of the Nichijou video. And those of you whose vision in hindsight is especially strong will notice that I did, in fact, hint in various ways throughout my Nichijou review that this was coming. I am aware that it is likely not many of you have actually seen Hyouka, as, in the West at least, it doesn't seem to be among Kyoto Animation's most well-known projects, only really amounting to a glorious display alongside its lesser unseen peers in the window of our internal Kyoto Animation corner stores, where new fans' inner children drool in anticipation of the quality awaiting them within its 22 episodes, without ever considering, in their free time, to actually give the series a proper shot. Tonight, they say, we're going to watch Clannad instead. I too once looked with pseudo-longing at Kyoto Animation's Hyouka. I bought it almost immediately. Actually, in a hint only hindsight could reveal, this Blu-ray set was also received as a gift, though from whom and at what time have both ironically transformed from solid dates to gelatinous solid likes, which no longer contain any real information. I too once abandoned my journey through Hyouka in order to watch Clannad instead, and as such, I more than anyone understand the feeling of wanting to like Hyouka, but not wanting to actually sit down and watch it, though I know not exactly why. Therefore, I consider this video itself to be an extended study into finding out why Kyoto Animation fans tend to ignore Hyouka, and what that might mean. As you might expect, we'll begin our journey into what I previously described as the most Kyoto Animation show with The Gateway. Following that, as is to be expected, we're going to make things a little bit personal, on a much smaller scale journey, focused largely on the here and now, which relates, curiously and thematically enough, to a non-germane, small-scale, and largely irrelevant mystery of our own. Once that's done, we'll discuss the key frame. And for those who feel like sticking around after the concluding epilogue which follows, there just may be a second round of Kyoto Animation Bingo awaiting you. All of that out of the way, let us begin the review, as always, with The Gateway. Hello and welcome to the first grand intermission in the Octo's Corner post-mortem commentary and review series. I am yet again your host, Octo, and before we jump in, I just want to get at least some small portion of the pleasantries out of the way. This first section is a chaotic mess, but, unlike most of the rest of the review, it is a chaotic mess that I intentionally made, rather than one I accidentally ended up making. One theme I wanted to explore in this video, and we'll get more into detail about this later on, so I'll try to leave this intermission a bit shorter than the rest, is the theme of regret. Another one is this burning, recurring question I wanted to answer myself over the course of the video. That being, what exactly it is that I want to do, or even what I can do. I'll talk about my two questions style of writing later on in this video, because, as I said, this is one of the sections where I think the thesis is the most clear on its own anyway, but one thing I do want to clear up ahead of this is what the point of having the thesis be what it is. Man, I am really bad at writing these intermissions, wow. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing throughout this chapter is comparing myself to the author of Hyouka. My thought process was that by reviewing the series at all, I have created a relationship with Hyouka to some degree, and that, I thought, might be fun to explore. We're going to go over what a light novel is, who the author of Hyouka, Honobu Yonezawa, is, what he's done besides Hyouka, because another theme is that I want to talk about Hyouka itself as little as possible. I'll explain that one later on as well. This whole section is mostly going over the difference between someone who writes original stories and someone who writes reviews, and about kind of how we classify into categories the written word. For that reason, and I guess a few reasons that I'm not fully convinced I know how to explain, I'm subtitling this section, How to Be Bad at Writing. I'm going to make the argument that throwing away your old art is a bad thing, because it prevents other people from figuring out if it's bad to them, or just bad to you. Deletion is the mark of a control freak. Yeah, that is a little hypocritical of me, I know, but I make videos that I don't really think I can count as art, so maybe it's different in my case. Anyway, that's what I wanted to do with this first chapter. It's an exploration of writers and why they write and why I see myself as being inferior on the basis that I am creating works that need someone else to be creative in order for me to be able to do what I do with them. That's me being self-aware as a critic and starting to have this sort of desire to make something that isn't based on something else, which is a feeling that will slowly begin to take over me over the course of this video. So, without further ado, let's jump into Chapter 1, The Gateway, or How to Be Bad at Writing. Much like the show itself, the novel series upon which Hyouka calls to find its general plot and characters is relatively unknown in the United States of America, and as a result, goes relatively undiscussed by the vast majority of Hyouka's fans. This is not the case for the series in Japan, but we will discuss that in greater detail later on. Worth noting now is that Hyouka's literary origins are not rooted in a light novel series. Normally, there would be some sort of on-screen vocab card explaining what exactly a light novel is, but in Hyouka's case especially, the definition of a light novel is caked with mud and misinformation, like the pig from Animal Farm if he one day decided to return to his roots by taking a dirt bath after a rainstorm. Ergo, we're now going to give that pig a bath in search of answers. Typically, the Japanese term Daito noberu refers to a work of literary fiction, usually a series aimed at younger readers, middle and high school readers to be exact. That said, non-light novels aimed at this studious demographic are also not altogether uncommon, as is antithetically frequent scenarios in which a man in his 40s will hide his copy of Hataraku Mao-sama behind a brown paper cover on the train back to Saitama. For this reason, we're going to need a more solid definition by which to judge a printed and bound, largely unillustrated work of written fiction as definitively light or heavy. Heavyweight, regular novels, or shousetsu in Japanese, are usually devoid of illustration, which for me at least was a good start. However, that would mean that the Monogatari series is comprised of nothing but light novels, which unnerves me almost as much as the thought that, by definition, this also means that most of the works of Jules Verne, once translated into Japanese, have somehow also become of the same general classification as Sword Art Online. Sword Art Online is a light novel. Monogatari and Jules Verne are art. Kino's journey is art, but some things can handle sharing shelf space with Sword Art Online, and some things could, but shouldn't be required to. Another perspective, one which I find much more reliable, comes to us from a writer by the name of Rikako on rokkaanime.jp, who claims the difference comes down to page count and general demographic. While, as previously discussed, the demographic provides us with only the same kind of circumstantial evidence the neighbor who owns out of no real necessity a spotless six-wheeled pickup truck might offer when he sees us trying to pack up our things and move house, the page number side of things is much more objectively quantifiable. We move when we can afford it, and a demographic basis would place light novel in the same genre category as a sibling to shonen and rom-com. Yeah, it's nice you own the truck, Monogatari, but I still can't tell if you're actually trying to help me move or if you're just trying to show off how good at regularly carrying things that truck you never use could be if it was on a farm instead of in your garage. The page count offered here is 300. Anything below that number is a light novel in Japanese, much like how anything below 200 pages in English is considered a novella rather than a full-size novel, so long as it contains, and I quote, some degree of prose. That's part of where the entire name Raito Noberu came from. The medium refers to itself as the Diet Cola of Japanese literature.
Wait, it's cola! I love cola!
Hyouka, worth noting, does not consider itself a light novel. Like Shinsekai Yori or The Perfect Insider, Hyouka markets itself as reading material for naught but the biggest of boys with the biggest of britches. Its page count tells a very different story. As listed on Amazon.jp, the actual novel page count for Hyouka is 224. Even once double-spaced and printed at a 14-point font size instead of a 12-point one, Hyouka would still be unable to escape the looming shadow of light novel classification in Japan, were it not for the general language used in Hyouka being just challenging enough in Japanese to cause 300 pages worth of time to read anyway. In this case, it seems our circumstantial truck owner neighbor has managed to come in handy after all. Hyouka wants us to classify it as shousetsu. Hyouka is the character in Cars who clamors in desperation that it's not over and that they can still race.
Don't take me out, Coach! I can still race!
I don't know why I'm talking about Cars so much here. Hyouka has nothing to do with Cars. This is not a video about Cars. Really, I think all this boils down to the fact that Hyouka is written for adults, isn't easy to read, and isn't, contrary to popular belief, the name of the series. Hyouka is just the name of the first book. KYOTO Animation named their adaptation after that first book, but under technicality, the series in which Hyouka marks the beginning 224 pages is actually called KOTENBU in Japan, a name which has already largely been accepted in the English-speaking world to mean Classic Literature Club. I call it Classic Lit Club in English, though, because I'm cool. Actually, that was a lie. I call it Hyouka, because up until recently, the thought of calling it anything else had never even crossed my mind, and because nobody in the West ever has, or ever will call it, KOTENBU. Here in the States, we know it as the Hyouka series colloquially, and that's fine. It's only not fine when we're talking about the novels expressly instead of the anime. Because some of KOTENBU's novels are longer than 300 pages and it desperately wants us to believe it a novel of cumbersome weight, most Japanese fans consider Hyouka by association a shousetsu rather than a Raito Noberu. Suffice to say, I don't claim to know better than the entire Japanese fan base, so novel it is, and novel it shall be. The author of KOTENBU is from Gifu Prefecture, a prefecture which, in addition to being famous for its production of traditional washi paper, was a tactical white whale during the Sengoku Jidai. This, however, is not what makes KOTENBU's author, one Honobu Yonezawa, so interesting. What makes Honobu Yonezawa so interesting is Honobu Yonezawa. This is an author who, as a student in the year 1989, began his career at age 11 by writing a sequel to H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. Most of us are guilty of fan fiction to some degree, and at some point in our lives, though I gotta be honest, I wish I ruled hard enough in middle school to be writing fanfiction sequels to War of the Worlds, instead of just reading the Subspace Emissary's World's Conquest in the computer lab. I first read War of the Worlds in 8th grade, when I chose to read it for a book report, and actually created for my presentation a diorama with working lights. I remember I was very proud of that War of the Worlds diorama. Historically, I've been very proud of all my book reports, and I remember a great deal of them because I never felt like I was phoning them in. I always instead wrote them because the reading material genuinely meant something special to me. At times, contrary to the instructions of my teachers, I wrote what I wanted to read instead of what was on the grading rubric. I vandalized my copy of The Great Gatsby because I wanted Gatsby to be a goat instead. Nonetheless, I still became enthralled with Gatsby's quest for the green light, that which drew him somewhere else. I wrote a paper which drew ire from my instructor because it was too long, too personal, and too concerned with explaining why I stopped calling it The Great Gatsby and at what point that had happened. At what point Gatsby had won my attention, respect, and had become something I wanted to read instead of another homework assignment. Another I wrote on The Catcher in the Rye was entirely focused on the ducks in Central Park. I didn't like Catcher in the Rye, but I wouldn't know why until years later when the book suddenly and in unexpected ways became unnervingly relatable. Even now, I don't like Catcher in the Rye. I don't like Life is Strange anymore either.
These aren't that good. These are kind of
I respect Catcher in the Rye. I acknowledge its importance, but I don't like it. So, I talked for 10 pages about what kind of ducks you can find in New York City's Central Park, and I borderline rambled about what each individual feather of the male mallard duck was metaphysically communicating, as well as why ducks, of all things, were in the book at all. Spoiler alert, they're there for the same reason there's a pigeon lady in Home Alone 2. Birds mean a lot, almost as much as feathers do. Don't ignore the birds in your media, just a little piece of advice from me to you. The following year, I wrote a book report on Stephen King's novel Desperation. My goal was to traumatize my teacher with that one. Instead, I delivered an essay so edgy that it literally gave me a paper cut when I stapled it together. I traumatized myself with that essay. I look back on that essay and I tell myself that I like the fact that I wrote it out of irony. Because Desperation is a masterpiece by nobody's definition. But because I didn't know any better back then and thought all authors wrote nothing but perfect works, I forced myself to like it, and then further forced myself to explain why it was better than what we were reading in school at the time for 10 double-spaced 12-point Calibri font pages. Stephen King's best work is Carrie, and if it isn't Carrie, it's Cujo, and if it isn't Cujo, it's the first half of It. I like Stephen King, and I'm definitely not as good a writer as he is, but I wouldn't consider every one of King's works faultless masterpieces. I just hid that opinion behind a wall of 10th grade obliviousness because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. You're not supposed to share opinions in your essays at school because your teacher wants to know that you know how to write what they asked you to write. It was never really about examining what the material was meant to make you feel, at least not in any of the classes I had. After that class, I associated that teacher and my efforts in her class with the same opinions in which I held the efforts toward my math class. If I don't have to, I'm not going to. And if I have to do it, I'm going to get it done as fast as possible. Nonetheless, when my mother grew angry with my teachers because I got a D on my final paper about The Great Gatsby, which she had read and which she thought was great, and they told her that, yes, it had been a good paper, but it wasn't the paper I had been assigned to write, I was happy with what I wrote anyway, because that's what I wanted to write. Like always, I was very proud of my War of the Worlds diorama. Then, at some point, I stopped being very, very proud of my War of the Worlds diorama. I decided it wasn't worth keeping around anymore, and I threw it away. Honobu Yonezawa evidently thought something similar because in 2002, when he scrubbed his personal website, Hanmuden, of all of his older writings, the Japanese War of the Worlds sequel fanfiction written by the hand of KOTENBU's creator was wiped by it forever. And to this day, its contents remain a mystery, unsolvable, even by the Classics Lit Club. I would throw away 1,000 War of the Worlds dioramas, each with working lasers, just to be able to read the first page of Honobu Yonezawa's War of the Worlds sequel. I doubt I'll ever be gifted the chance. In 11th grade, I wrote an essay on The Old Man in the Sea, an essay for which I learned to cite in MLA format a quote from a video game. That video game was called Focus. Back then, I never thought to save anything digitally. As such, my detailed explanation of how The Old Man in the Sea and Focus both required of those interacting with them the ability to read beyond their literal occurrences and dive into the metaphorical oceans beneath the old man's boat in search of everything and nothing all at once no longer exists. Focus was a game about finding literal hidden people, each of whom represented a seemingly small problem with their creator, until, when focused on, they suddenly appeared enormous and uncontrollable. These little people could be killed under the weight of a thumbtack, and yet somehow, when playing Focus, any one of them could tell you that the world is coming to an end because of them, and you would believe it. I believed it. The Old Man in the Sea, I argued in my essay, was much the same. If you only looked at the thing itself, you'd find a very boring story about a man, a child, and a boat. If you looked for the hidden little people with your special little camera, you might, eventually, be able to read between the lines enough to find something hidden therein. The meaning was small, I argued, literally non-existent, until you started looking for it. That essay is lost forever. I asked once if my English teacher had a copy of it. She didn't. Consequently, I've spent the rest of my life thinking that the best thing I'll ever write is lost, and throwing unfinished essays on websites like Medium, never publishing any of them because, unfortunately, all of them are terrible. All of this is to say that I understand why Honobu Yonezawa deleted his works. I just wish he'd let us read them first instead of deciding on his own that his older works aren't worth being seen anymore, and to say that I'm guilty of the same actions, and have no intent to ever rectify them. We're all selfish to some degree, I suppose. The difference is that what Honobu Yonezawa created was no doubt original, his own stories, worlds, adventures, creations. All my works are by definition derivative. They could not exist without something else because they need to leech off of and criticize and analyze something else in order to be written. I suppose in the end that makes me no more creative than anybody else. Honobu Yonezawa, on the other hand, was a born storyteller, and published his first novel, Hyouka, in the Niece of Time, perhaps the world's only 224-page full-size novel, in 2001. Honobu Yonezawa is, by literal definition, creative. He creates. He's very good at creating, as a matter of fact. In 2001, Hyouka won Most Recommended in Horror and Mystery at the 5th Kadokawa Gakuen Novel Awards. By what metric anyone measures that leads to Hyouka's genre being described as horror, I may never know, but it received the award nonetheless. In 2010, he wrote a movie for the Japanese division of Warner Bros., a thriller mystery film called MISINFORMATION, 7-Day Death Game. I didn't watch it, because it being called MISINFORMATION told me all I needed to know. Maybe I'll watch it some other time, but for now, MISINFORMATION, you can stay at least 100 legal feet or 30 meters away from me and my family at all times. In 2014, a short story collection he published entitled Mangan won first prize in the Mysteries We Want to Read, Weekly Published Mysteries Top 10, and This Mystery is Amazing categories, and he won all the same awards again with another of his works just 1 year later, with the release of Kings and Circuses. In 2016, he was recognized as one of Japan's greatest young novelists by Granta, a literature magazine from the UK. In 2017, Hyouka received a live-action movie, the contents of which I've examined in great detail, and the findings of which I shall relay at a later point in this review. In 2024, the year I researched for and subsequently wrote the script for this review, Honobu Yonezawa's other famous slice-of-life series, The Small Citizens, or Shomishin series, which began with the publication of the Strawberry Tart Incident in the year 2004, received an anime adaptation as well. You can watch that anime series right now if you want. But unfortunately, given that it was neither animated by KYOTO Animation nor released before 2012's production of KOTENBU, I deemed it unnecessary viewing as a prerequisite for experiencing KYOTO Animation's Hyouka, and have therefore not yet chosen to watch it as of writing this script. As to why KYOTO Animation chose to animate Hyouka, and why of all times to do so they chose the year 2012, just 1 year following their greatest financial disappointment, especially speculative viewers who in old lady gossip circles oft contribute compositions more comprised of compromising cases they created than of any sort of truthful tales, might hypothesize that Hyouka happened because KYOTO Animation wished to see itself bounce back from Nichijou, with a show flourishing with its own immediately recognizable studio-specific isms. That they felt they needed to create a series that would assuredly fly off store shelves, even as Blu-ray sets of its then most recent work would perform right next to Hyouka, a casual 9-to-5 job collecting dust, for which they receive no recognition and no pay. The problem with this hypothesis is illustrated by Violet Evergarden, of all things, whose broadcast of its first episode happened so far in advance of the rest of the series that it became immediately obvious then that KYOTO Animation's projects are scheduled far enough ahead of their production and broadcast that when Hyouka was decided upon as the follow-up to Nichijou, Nichijou was probably still happening, and probably not seen as a disappointment from a monetary perspective by the studio just yet.
単純なバカでありたい。
Either way, Hyouka was not created out of desperation. How could it be? From the very beginning, Hyouka was created out of passion. After convincing his skeptical parents to give him just 2 years to prove he could accomplish his dreams of becoming a writer, Honobu Yonezawa would submit Hyouka to the 5th Gakuen Novel Awards from Kadokawa, having written it in his free time while working a part-time position at a bookstore. An award which you already know that he won. Desperation happened by coincidence in both cases. Nothing in art ever came about by being desperate to succeed. At least, never solely on the merits of itself. Desperate people can make good art, but they typically make it in spite of their desperation, not because of it. By the time Hyouka actually released, and only by that time, had it become obvious to its creators that failure was even less of an option than using the knife as your sub-weapon in Castlevania on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The knife, for those of you who are unaware, sucks. Hyouka, of course, does not. Of course, that still doesn't answer the question at hand. Why did KYOTO Animation choose to animate Hyouka? At the lack of any immediate answer, and figuring that I would have to do this at some point anyway, I bought the novel. Actually, that was a lie. I bought the first 4 novels, encompassing the entirety of the content KYOTO Animation's Hyouka takes inspiration from. Originally, the KOTENBU series was intended as a mere trilogy, in line with the initial plan for the entire KOTENBU series. I started by reading the first 3. While no official release in English ever happened, this wound is medicated somewhat by the existence of fan-translated English versions, though seeing as how I experienced the series entirely in Japanese, I can't speak for the quality of these translations, nor can I divulge where exactly to find them. I can only tell you that they exist, and that if you read them, you will be doing so at your own risk. I came away from that long and difficult 3-book path having read no less than 880 pages of Japanese novel. I learned a lot from reading these books. I spent the tail end of my summer days in 2024 reading leisurely outside in the sun, basking in the warmth of the day in my library, sitting on my giant Snorlax friend surrounded by a large group of Pokemon plushies, reading KOTENBU. When, like an animal emerging from a long winter's nap, I left the world of Japanese novels at KOTENBU Part 3's conclusion, I found myself in a very different emotional position than when I began. We can talk more about all of that, however, a little later. For now, the most integral content from the books which has been changed in the KYOTO animation production is the time period. KOTENBU begins its tale in the year 2000, as stated by its first book, Hyouka. Ice Cream, or Shaved Ice, however, playfully and strategically shifts its story's beginning 12 years into the future, so as to be considered present in the year of its release. Of course, we can't ignore the global significance of both of these years in superstitious history. The year 2000 incited in the global population a mass panic of sorts. Y2K and the grand misunderstanding of what exactly that meant created in its wake a mass panic, which was ultimately unfounded, as did the supposed rolling over of the Mayan calendar in 2012. We needn't worry too much about that here and now, but it is vaguely interesting that Hyouka's arrival in both instances happened to coincide with the world's own mysteries and superstitious outbreaks. Accidental or otherwise, I find this fact mildly amusing, and at the very least, worth pointing out. Hyouka, it would seem, is always readily available at the end of the world, constantly surrounded by and sharing spotlight with mystery and intrigue, the likes of which are comparable to that of its deep and distant cousin, a sequel to H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds that nobody will ever read. Here at the Gateway's End, I suppose that's all we can really ask to know before jumping in for ourselves. Why did KYOTO Animation choose to animate Hyouka at the end of the world? Hello, and welcome back to another intermission. I said this before, but if you already like Hyouka, this video is not for you. Like I said, I mentioned that before, but I want to make it especially clear here that that is the case. I mentioned also before that I used to frequently watch anime together with my little brother. As a matter of fact, that fact is going to become integral as a part of my personal history, both with Hyouka and Haruhi Suzumiya. I'm assuming that you're watching the Haruhi review first, but on the off chance that you are not, I shan't dream of spoiling that experience here. Instead, I'll just reiterate that my brother and I trotted nonchalantly through Hyouka's first 14 episodes in pure awe of the animation quality, but that we unfortunately gained practically nothing outside of that. We felt that the mysteries were dull, that the characters were either difficult to relate to or conversely too relatable in the case of the main character Hotaru Oriki, and eventually we just decided together, without using words, that we no longer wanted to spend our time watching Hyouka together. Now that was a shame to me for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being that I felt very passionately, even back then, that Hyouka was probably KYOTO Animation's masterpiece. It looks very pretty after all, and it feels exactly like it belongs in KYOTO Animation's repertoire. Therefore, the years which followed saw me repeatedly glance back at my KYOTO Animation collection shelf and sigh with wonderment as to what I may have missed about Hyouka back when my younger sibling and I had given it repeated college tries to impress us and had come away from each empty-handed. The me who is about to regale you with tales of the greater anime fandom's excessive underwhelmment with KYOTO Animation's Hyouka is the me who believes that I must have been missing something when I originally watched the show. The me who was too afraid of being called out by those that do enjoy the show for not being able to enjoy it enough to make a multi-hour video essay about it to say that I didn't like it. This is me attempting to explain myself in cloak and dagger cowardice behind making fun of other people who felt the same way I once did. The reason I chose to do it that way is because, though I too have used the word boring as a critique in the past, I knew also that something must be trapped inside of Hyouka somewhere. I considered these raving reviewers to be missing something. I wondered if perhaps they felt attacked by Hyouka in the same way that I did. The great hypocrisy in this is that I, at one point or another, was every single one of the reviewers that I mock. In many ways, I feel like it was in good fun to mock them, and in so doing, mock my past self for thinking that Hyouka's problems were its own, and not just problems I had with myself that I, back then, failed to recognize. That's kind of an ongoing theme with this whole video, to be honest. I wondered what KYOTO Animation were trying to say, what Honobu Yonezawa was trying to say, and why it bothered me so much that I didn't relate to the show the way some part of myself felt that I ought to. I think sometimes that perhaps my younger brother felt the same way. It is definitely not the case that Hyouka is, as slice-of-life critics oft proclaim, about nothing. I know this now, after having finished work on the original version of this review, and I knew it then, too. Back when I gave the series a try for the first time. Hyouka does not, to me, look like a cash grab. It is not a cheap animation made to sell more copies of a book. Later on, we will discuss why I think KYOTO Animations themselves thought something similar, as nobody on staff seemed to want to work on the show at first either. I went into Chapter 2 of this review wanting to find out why so many people, my past self included, react negatively to Hyouka their first time around. I always try to ask and answer at least 2 questions whenever I write something. One of them is a literal question about the thing I'm talking about, and the other one is usually a deep and therapeutic question about myself. In this chapter, the first question is this: why does good art sometimes make us upset when we look at it? What is it about Hyouka that makes people angry? Because it definitely is not boredom that makes a person leave an angry review on the internet. So, as we go into this section of this review, note that what I am attempting to do here is explore the relationship between people and their interests, all the while coming to the conclusion that I can relate to Hyouka's main character a lot more than I originally realized. This is where I began to understand what it was about Hyouka that bothered me, and why it was so hard for me to talk about it. The second, and more personal question I asked myself going into this section then, can be defined as this: what makes something worth doing for me? And why does that matter? I ended up coming to the conclusion that Hyouka itself asks the second question just as much as I did while writing this review. You might be able to look past my fancy prose and see me, squirming and cowardly, hiding behind the word you, when I make my assumptive statements about people who think Hyouka is boring. You might consider thinking of it as me talking to myself, in that metaphysical hallway of my mind I so frequently mention in this video, rather than accosting any of my viewers. Is that pretentious? Yeah, a little bit. Oh well, let's just jump in. For those who consider themselves veterans of KYOTO Animation's highly speculated about, but nonetheless fictitious status quo, Hyouka, ice cream or shaved ice, does not, at first, seem all that special. This is an observation that led a substantial portion of Hyouka's less enthusiastic viewers to the conclusion that actually finishing the series was optional, and that they could, long in advance of the final episode's credits, describe Hyouka in exactly one word: boring. A word which they would then spend a couple hundred more words explaining in detail. This, I can promise you, is a tactic with which I am acutely familiar. Of the multitude of scathing amateur reviews left by series detractors in their free time with their free accounts on a forum somewhere, some of my favorite excerpts, whose authors shall be kept anonymous for today's purposes, are as follows.
The real mystery here is how anyone could produce 22 episodes for one of one of the easily most boring animes this planet has ever known. Everyone rating Hyouka over 6 is either biased or just really elusive. I do not know what they meant by saying elusive in this review. I have pondered it for many a sleepless night. I apologize in advance if my review happens to be Bathed in profanity and violent intent.
I assure you, I am typing this
In a fit of rage, right after I watched the abomination that is Hyouka.
Let me just begin with the art of the series. Amazing, superb, beautiful, and there is a lot of scenery porn for all you scenery porn fans out there. But I didn't watch this anime for scenery porn. If I wanted to look at scenery porn, I could have just gone on Tumblr instead.
Pair a MC who is proudly boring and make him solve boring mysteries and you get a boring show. I'm offended. After seeing so many reviews giving it an 8+,
whatever that means,
and being a huge mystery fan, I had high expectations. I've tried several times to watch this. I'm on episode 19, and I just have to drop it. This anime is just boring. The mysteries are mundane things like, why did the dog pee in this spot of the lawn when they normally pee in that spot? No joke. If I hear Kini Narimasu one more time, I might go crazy. This was such a disappointment. Seriously, I had such huge expectations about this anime, and then 2 episodes in, I was either yawning or twitching because of many reasons. Well, I think I speak for all of us when I say I do hope you're able to narrow down those reasons and put a stop to the twitching real soon. With all of these reviews and their superlative language mixed in with 1 or 2 that admittedly do a good job of describing with gentle maturity the reasons why someone might not find themselves particularly engaged with the general vibe that Hyouka gives off, there happens to be one review tagging the series as not recommended that I believe says something rather interesting. Unlike the others, I will be giving credit where credit is due here, as this review, written by one Wolfgunblood D, is worthy not of ridicule or mockery, but in fact high praise, various grammatical errors aside. They say, and I quote, Hyouka is one of the best anime of all time, but statistically, most of the people are dumb, and by dumb, I imply many factors. It's not something about IQ, it's about point of view of the people in general. Even though many of you can disagree with me, there is no doubt that most of the people are not self-conscious. They just live their life without thinking about it much, and that is why they can find Hyouka a very boring and tedious. That line at the end there about individuals and the lives they lead is the key phrase here, and may very well end up being the key frame for this entire review. I don't usually encourage vigorous note-taking when watching my reviews, and I'm not going to begin doing so here. But if you wanted to write down that particular part of someone else's review and keep it physically close to your person until the end of our time together, I wouldn't particularly blame you. Continuing their train of thought, Wolfgunblood D writes, you can't decide which mystery is better just by looking at the scale. For example, tell me which of the mysteries is better, where you need to find a reason for why most of the people in the world turned into zombies, or why some robber stole the useless frying pan at the summer festival. You'll definitely say it is the first one that is so intriguing, but you can't tell just by looking at the scale of these mysteries. It's writing-wise by that you can tell which one is better. I bring up this particular review at this particular point in my own review for precisely 2 reasons. The first is that, as previously mentioned, you'll find their review of Hyouka, one which calls it one of the greatest anime of all time, under the section labeled Not Recommended on My Anime List's reviews of Hyouka, which does, in all seriousness, only dictate a small percentage of those who took the time to leave a review, the vast majority of Hyouka's reviewers being neutral or outspokenly delighted in their mosaics of internet slang and anime-specific written ciphers. Despite numerous other literary mistakes in presentation, this particular oddity about this particular review is unquestionably intentional. As they say toward the end of their review, I do not recommend this anime to most of the people. as most of them do not think very much, and just like to watch some action with demons, blood, murders, and other fiction and unrealistic stuff. If it's not clear enough already, allow me to echo this review by doubling down on the words of our Hyouka pondering philosopher. If you think that Hyouka is boring, it's either because you think your own life is boring, or because life has already taken you to places you consider to be much more objectively interesting than your school library. I'm now going to spend some 40-odd minutes explaining why that is. If you can relate now to Hyouka's main character, the one multiple negative reviews call lazy, the one who looks, and I quote, like he hates being in his own show, if you can stare at Hotaru Oreki and see in his eyes a reflection of yourself, like I could, you might find him more than a little frustrating at first for reasons you can't quite put your finger on. Oreki's general outlook on life is one of indifference. He claims this is to conserve energy, that it's all part of some master plan, but realistically, I don't think anyone ever actually bought that lie, least of all his best friend Satoshi Fukube or his sister Tomoe. No, what Oreki is doing is the same thing I often did in my English classes, as well as in high school in general. He carries with him the same attitude I once carried toward non-major focused college classes, that in my own eyes and from my limited perspective, I had to take solely because they were required by the university, and not because they actually mattered to me in the slightest. Hotaru Oreki might, at some point, want to do something. But right now, at the beginning of Hyouka's animated run, he doesn't. He chooses, intentionally, to not care about anything that could be described by others as important, and in refraining from the larger activities of the world around him that so delight his high school peers, he instead observes peacefully his surroundings and casually documents their many minute details, perhaps unaware that such meticulous memorizations are even taking place. A lot of audience members will find this frustrating because that isn't the way they choose to live their lives, and that's fine. Hyouka completely understands this frustration, and that's why it's given Oreki Hotaru an exceptionally outgoing friend in Satoshi Fukube, the series resident Isshiki, and the subject of extended future discussion, I assure you. It's also why, as we come to find out rather quickly, Oreki's older sister volunteers him to do something for her, a job that she knows is actually substantially more trouble than it's worth. She wants for her brother, as Satoshi equally does, an experience of some kind, rightfully fearing that without acting on something, without some form of participation in a grander societal activity, Oreki can never truly grow as a person. With the introduction of these characters, Hyouka asks the same question as these disgruntled audience members do. When, it asks of Hotaru Oreki, of its own main character, are you going to decide to do something interesting? My parents didn't ask me to join an after-school club so much as they took it upon themselves to join one for me. Thus, although by then I had accrued a severe and serious hatred for the art of long-distance running, a sport that I now recognize as highly respectable, I stayed after school every day to perform long-distance running tasks with a group of people whose names and faces appear to me now as wavy lines, blurred and illegible, which I could neither recognize today nor ever distinguish one from another. The ceaseless agony of my legs, in the absence of any form of strengthening muscle, would periodically transform from ceaseless to cease not at all, when on occasion I was required to attend cross-country races on weekends. My parents were often proud of my performance in these races, but that mattered very little to me because the activity wasn't one I chose to do for myself. I chose for myself some years later to run a half marathon, because I wanted to see if I could do it, and because I wanted an excuse to eat what others in the running community called the magic beans. Nowadays, I'm smart enough to get my caffeine fix from other sources instead. In remembering this, I find that Hotaru Oreki and I, with much the same feeling and energy, look longingly out and conversely back into a window, somewhere in the metaphysical hallway of a school I used to study at. And we think the same thought in opposite directions.
completely unaware that we are in fact speaking to each other. One of us in an ode to the energy it must take to run outside, the other in ode to the courage it must take to stay indoors. For reasons unknown, I never told my parents that what I really wanted to do was join the Gamers Club, who met conveniently in the same gymnasium as my tall, slender cohorts and their uncomfortably revealing running gear, and whose activities I watched with a deeply bubbling envy that I, at that point in my life, did not yet understand. With each meeting of the cross-country team, I watched as the small group of kids in the gymnasium gathered, like Boy Scouts round a campfire, and stared at a large projector which bellowed from its newly purchased speakers Super Smash Bros. Music, and displayed on the inner wall of the school a fighter selection screen. I watched in awe as eager young players preemptively blamed their controllers for their lackluster performances as Mewtwo, young Link, and Mario. And I wanted more than anything to pick up my own controller and join in the playful gaming banter. The others in my running group, meanwhile, stretched and prepared to run around the empty lot which was to serve as the institution's yet-to-be-constructed high school. And as we ran and sweat and hurt, I, a middle school kid who had always let my parents decide for me what I was supposed to do, began to realize that with each passing day and each painful thud of my Nikes on the sun-baked dirt, I was longing more and more fervently to be on the side of the gymnasium where the bullied hung out, not the one where echoed the voices of sports husks in lieu of any perceivable personality that no pain was no gain. Instead of saying anything about the Gamers Club, I bartered with my mother, who at that time didn't want any game with a rating that did not accompany the words "for everyone" anywhere near the house, to earn over time a copy of Super Smash Bros. Brawl. My mother knew by then of my dislike of the sport, and thus allowed me to own the T-rated game only under the condition that I endure cross-country until the end of the school year. She did this with no malicious intent. I just think she was afraid of what might have become of me if I instead stayed home and did what she passionately described as nothing all day. At the end of the school year, having completed my quest, I played Subspace Emissary, and I became wise to the larger world of Nintendo. Before that, I believed Samus Aran's Varia suit design had come from Halo, a game series I had promised my mother I would never play with the power of my pinky. A game which I still have not, and will not, on my honor, ever touch. Not because of anything in the game, not because I hold some sort of grudge against it, but because I promised my mother that I would not. Nowadays, Metroid Prime Remastered joins Dread as being among the easiest games to describe as likable experiences of any that I've played on my Animal Crossing Special Edition Nintendo Switch, a console whose story of obtainment I shall have to share another day. I realized back then that not everyone finds the same things interesting. Some people run recreationally, and some people just really like video games. I really don't like video games. And I also really like video games. In ponderously reconsidering the myopic musings of my anime list's nitpicking disparagers, it becomes abundantly clear that these people, who relentlessly exclaim with the same misplaced confidence a supervillain has when he's at long last reached the part of the movie where he gets to gloat about the exact details of his nefarious plan, that Hyouka is, and I repeatedly quote, boring, aren't so much cartoonishly negative as they are people who can't be bothered to understand themselves and their feelings. I know this about these complete internet strangers because in using the word boring, they have each unintentionally outed their own emotional states. Boring implies a lack of engagement, and if any of Hyouka's naysayers were actually as disengaged with the show as they claim they were in their reviews, they probably wouldn't have bothered reviewing the series at all. Bored people don't go out of their way to write intensely negative reviews on a website that isn't Twitter. That's what angry people do. Somewhere nestled within the nucleus of Hyouka's in-universe societal demand of that which is interesting only because of repeated popular proclamation sits Hotaro Oreki. Sits you. Sits me. I was as uninterested back in middle school in running recreationally as the rest of the greater running community was in the existence of video games beyond Pac-Man and Mario Kart, games about which I care enough to have multiple disregarded Octo's Corner scripts exclusively dedicated to. Back then, the various sports of my middle school occupied the same labeled status within my mind as the turkey vulture occupies in the IUCN. Least concern. Likewise, at what Satoshi describes as the veritable mecca of extracurricular activities, God's Mountain High School, Hotaru Oreki's mind is unconcerned with the desperate screeches of the flocks of sentient leather vultures looking to feast on the carcasses of their members' free time after class. Instead, he considers these interests cliché. Beyond his internal queries of who it was that awarded any of the activities typically associated with high school, sports, clubs, teenage romance, and musical theater, a ribbon marking them as being worthwhile, Oreki checks the box labeled Opt Out in his mind's internal pop-up window when it asks him to care about any of what we've come to expect out of a laid-back Japanese series that takes place in high school. He does this because he finds them compatible with a certain word that I've now taken upon myself to exclaim a great number of times with profusely negative connotations in this section of this review. Boring is a code word among inexperienced reviewers. They use it because they mistakenly believe that I'm angry because the things that are happening are not the things that I wanted to see, and I have no interest in this whatsoever mean the same thing. The word boring fills professional critics' thought spaghetti with a unique blend of the true nature of fear and mental images of an empty wallet being turned upside down and shaken, revealing in its worn-out, leathery folds nothing but a couple of paper clips and a group of flies just small enough that swarm feels like an exaggeration. The reason why there are more reviews of an exceptionally bad thing than there are of an exceptionally boring thing is because boring, as a word, as a meaning, as a fact, simply and coldly fails as a potentially viral turn of phrase. It literally means the exact opposite of the thing people who write reviews get paid to search for. None of these descriptors can possibly be applied to Hyouka because if they could, it almost definitely would not have been animated as though it were under the direct jurisdiction of a deity whose entire perfection is their ability to make lo-fi animated mystery solving look good. In that regard, Yasuhiro Takemoto is a god. Hyouka illustrates the inner mechanisms of its four main characters' minds with the kind of immaterial fluidity that can only exist when you're meticulously visualizing someone else's train of thought. Hyouka is the only series I've ever seen where I was consistently excited for the part where the characters would begin dropping exposition on me like a Vegas buffet drops leftovers in a dumpster. Because each and every time they did, my eyes were gifted an entire Halloween's worth of delectable treats. The obvious comparison to make here is the live-action mystery program Sherlock, which began 2 years before Hyouka did. Thus, the level of interest the animation team may have had in making the shifting of its characters' internal brain gears look exactly as good to me as a heavily filtered Instagram cooking video looks to a starving person was probably at least partially raised by the constant shouts of praise for the way Sherlock handled the thought visualizations of its titular character. 2 years and the staff at KYOTO Animation, however, are not easy opponents to match. As such, the output of Hyouka's animators, by comparison, regardless of whether they found visual inspiration from Benedict Cumberbatch's internal think tank within the series or his exceptionally alluring facial expressions, could three-stock Sherlock any day of the week. Final destination, no items. This meticulous beauty and objective prettiness extends with particular strength and fortitude to the character from Hyouka that everyone, even those who have never seen it, instantly recognize. Eru Chitanda.
Eru Chitanda is Rumpelstiltskin's worst nightmare. Gold made from straw that is wildly good at taking names, even when the people who own those names expressly do not beforehand wish for them to be taken. Eru Chitanda is awesome.
Okay, editing Octo here. As usual by now, I have made a severe and continuous lapse in my judgment when it comes to a singular character's name and how to pronounce it. So, I don't know why this keeps happening. It's really early in the morning, I'm tired, and all I'm gonna say is, instead of calling him Satoshi Fukube with an U sound in the middle, I'm now going to be calling him by the name of his corn cob-shaped brother, Satoshi Fukabe, and I'm not fixing this problem, so you're just going to have to deal with it. I'll cut out his last name where I can, but yeah, I don't know what happened here. I said it right the first time. Octo, why does this keep happening?
Satoshi Fukabe, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. Straw that looks gold under the proper lighting conditions, who'd prefer to make up his own names rather than guess other people's. Satoshi Fukabe would have a point card to Rumpelstiltskin's pop-up shop that he would never fill up only because he would perpetually forget to bring the card with him, even though he goes there like every other week.
Everybody makes mistakes once in a while. Did he forget what he looks like?
Then there's the girl who never stood a chance with Fukabe, the girl who loved him anyway, and the girl who later hated him with all the pettiness of a young adult man who understands what it means to be hated by a young adult woman at school for what are ultimately, to him, a series of indiscernible reasons, and who has now channeled that experience into a well-animated fictional character. When you're in middle school, you have a hard time viewing the world outside of yourself. When you're in middle school, you think you're the main character. Satoshi Fukabe never grew out of that phase, no matter how good he is at hiding himself behind a veil of kindness and extracurricular ebullience. I do not use this kind of language lightly. The argument that Satoshi Fukabe is kind is predicated on the argument that he isn't capable of understanding others, at least not at first. He doesn't understand why Discount Kumiko from Sound Euphonium is suddenly upset with him over a simple rejection, as evidenced by multiple examples of one-sided awkwardness that he never notices. Moments that make me recede into the comfort of my shirt and wrinkle like a prune under time-lapse with second-hand embarrassment. By that logic, Hotaru Oraki doesn't fare much better. His feelings for Chitanda are largely superficial at the show's introduction. What's worse is that he assumes she feels the same way about him, the kind of way that can transform a coffee shop into a lover's retreat, the kind of way that makes him freeze in place when she closes in, the kind of way that makes flowers of the night bloom in her pocket, and gorgeous greenery erupt in her midnight-colored locks. The kind of way I felt about someone I used to think that I loved back in middle school. Eru Chitanda does not visibly understand this feeling. If Chitanda feels for Hotaru anything at all in Hyouka, her feelings are not superficial, and they don't make the world around her sink into shades of Valentine's Day gift baskets. Chitanda never plays coy with Oraki or tries to slip comfortably away from him when he gets too close, and she never acts on the kinds of teenage fantasies that control Hotaru's every waking action around her. She, like his older sister before her, takes his energy by force, and though he has every ability to simply reject these requests, Oraki instead goes along with the various desires of the women in his life rather than desiring for himself anything at all. He may be going with the flow, but it's the girls that are pouring the water. There is, of course, much more to Eru Chitanda than this oversimplification of her character infers, but we can get into semantics about that a little later on. As an audience, we demand that Hotaru eventually do something about this. Again, we ask, in frustration, when is Oraki going to get up and do something? The answer is that outside of Eru Chitanda, Oraki Hotaru will never, and could never, do anything. Oraki Hotaru's talents always exist as potential energy. Things that he could do, that he simply hasn't yet. Or more accurately, that he's decided he won't do for the sake of his self-proclaimed ideals. He won't ask Chitanda on a date, he won't write, and he won't solve mysteries. All of these are eventually asked of him by Chitanda herself, with the exception of the date, though the fact is not lost on me that in Oreki's mind the date request is quite possibly already being filled by Chitanda's various errands and meetups at almost every turn anyway. As for Hotaru Oreki, all of his talents exist as naught but potential energy, and on his own, he is incapable of converting them into kinetics. These invisible walls and their unseen brick and mortar blockades present us once again with a truth that is harder and colder than all but the most seasoned of detectives' honesty bombs, and contains at least 6 times as much shrapnel. Oreki simply doesn't feel motivated to do anything in particular, and he struggles to understand those that do. Time and time again throughout Hyouka's 22-episode run, Oreki is confronted with overwhelming displays of incredible effort, and though almost every one of them is bleakly amateur in execution, they all represent something tangible that Oreki, despite his talents, cannot muster. An unfinished film, high school heroism, the written word, even rebellion in the face of simply going along with what he's been told to do by those he perceives as being in control, those he refuses to fight back against or even voice his contrary desires to. In Hyouka's first half, we can see these things. We can't, however, see anything Hotaru Oreki does, with exactly one exception that those who have seen the show likely already have playing back in their mind's eye at this very moment. The one time Hotaru Oreki put together an entire bogus mystery just to avoid having to go to the music room, just to try proving that he could be in control too. Ultimately, the original given subtitle of KOTENBU's introductory novel, a title which was later replaced in print by The Niece of Time, in reference to Josephine Tey's The Daughter of Time, echoes through the halls of my mind like the dinner bell at an old chateau echoes through its halls at supper time, as being especially relevant to this aspect of Oreki's character. The original subtitle was, in fact, You Can't Escape. As objectively cool as it is to be named after a Josephine Tey novel, the original subtitle, You Can't Escape, acts as a subtitle should, while The Niece of Time is just a pun that happens to be literally relevant to literal story events. This kind of subtitle is useless 99% of the time. This kind of subtitle is literary uncertainty, creative insecurity, and empty checking accounts in the bank of hope. Trust me, I know. I give almost everything I write a subtitle, and I do it for these exact reasons.
Heck, you might consider this entire post-mortem explanation segment an extended subtitle. Probably just makes the piece worse, honestly, but what the heck. I'm leaving it up this time regardless, and if it gets disliked, that's fine. It's like Koro-sensei says, the difference between the novice and the master is that the master has failed more times than the novice has tried. Anyway,
subtitles are marketing blurbs, extra explanation, and clarification that anyone who actually engages with the thing on its own merit could figure out on their own anyway. That's almost certainly why the anime never got a subtitle, and why it's just called Hyouka. Well, one of the reasons, anyway. Subtitles in the KOTENBU series, on the other hand, are pretty much only bad things, which stands in direct contrast with the writing of the series itself. The anime understands this very well. At the end of every episode, Hyouka presents us with a distinct lack of a to-be-continued sign, much like Nichijou before it. Here, it replaces those notices with subtitles that correspond to which book it's currently adapting. Of all these potential names the KOTENBU series could take, I think I agree most with KYOTO Animation's decision to call the entire series Hyouka, and that if it ever did require a subtitle for any reason, that subtitle should be You Can't Escape. Not just because of what it means for the show itself, or because it was the name of the wannabe heavyweight that we still won't call a light novel, the one that started this whole mess, but because of something a bit more specific. Something we will assuredly revisit later on in this review.
Hyouka screams at its audience with its title for the entirety of its first arc. Then it spends the rest of its runtime being devoured. Devoured by itself. And also, why does the English logo look so good anyway? I mean, I get it. It does what it's supposed to do. It basically transforms the Japanese text into an equivalent font, at times directly using pieces of the Japanese original text, but it does it so well and so seamlessly that the final product is nothing short of beautiful. I didn't talk about Nichijo's English logo because Nichijo's logo never really came up, but English logos of anime titles are unsung heroes, man. They are more often than not the pinnacle of what it means to utilize proper graphic design via text. Translating the style of a logo goes a long way in telling me that you care. Anime localization teams who haven't hired me yet put way more effort into those things. Some of them are incredible. They match the style of the show and actively make me want to buy them more, while others can make me pass on a Blu-ray I otherwise might have wanted. In the same way I can't escape bad anime marketing ploys and poor English logo designs, Hotaru Oreki can't escape the whims of the women in his life or the spells that Chitanda casts over him. More accurately than that, however, Hyouka's first half presents us with a Hotaru Oreki who will never choose to speak up for himself if what he wants doesn't correlate with what his club members do. He is the epitome of the modern Japanese archetype. The nail that never sticks out and blissfully averts the gaze of the hammer in consequence. And on that note, I believe it's time to take a look at the Isshiki of the day. Hello and welcome to the Isshiki of the day. I am Caden Rogers, also known as Octo, and this is the historic first episode of a series in which we look at every Isshiki in KYOTO Animation's history. My previous foray into the world of KYOTO Animation saw me reach the inexcusable conclusion that Nichijo has no Isshiki, a fact which would have warranted an entire week's worth of mourning were it not for the fact that Nichijo made up for its lack of Isshiki in other worthwhile ways, which I relayed at length in that review. For Hyouka, however, this conclusion thankfully need not be repeated. Hyouka, you see, does have an Isshiki. For this momentous occasion, I have built an entire set out of digital cardboard, and speaking directly to my future self, if you don't save this background video for future use, I will kill you. And we're the same person. You know what that means, Caden.
You know what that means. Isshiki's definition sounds
shall nonetheless remain unspoken, but with each and every microsode of the Isshiki of the day, I suppose in my own mind that your opinions and general understanding of what in the actual literal hell an Isshiki even is should eventually become as distinctly understood as fictional depictions of hell itself, which is where the Isshiki probably comes from, and where he undoubtedly shall return at the end of his days in the sun. I love the Isshiki, and one day, young grasshopper, you will love the Isshiki too. Hyouka's Isshiki is Satoshi Fukabe, a character we have thus far described as kind, cunning, and stupid. A character who is not concerned with his best friend's transition from regular high schooler into Playboy mansion owner, but rather supportively is instead concerned with Hotaru Oreki's transition from gloomy little rain cloud into functional member of society. He means very well in this endeavor. He just doesn't understand his friend as well as he thinks he does. Except for when it comes to Oreki's desire for a relationship with Chitanda, which is something he knows quite well. To be clear, Oreki never said he wanted a romantic relationship with Chitanda in Hyouka's early episodes. He didn't have to. This scene gave it away. So did this one. So did this one. In this way, it becomes immediately clear that Hyouka's Isshiki has fundamentally failed at being a proper Isshiki. I know this because while it's still true that Satoshi views himself as the main character, he does not view Hotaru Oreki as his girl-getting wingman. Fukabe neither indulges in the kind of habitual delinquency typical of more Dokyun or Yankee-style depictions of the Isshiki which define the key adaptations, nor is persistently pursuing potential partners passionately, behavior characteristic of Kyoto Animation's postmodern or golden age Isshiki. Satoshi Fukabe isn't even voiced by Greg Ayres in the English dub, though he is voiced by his Japanese equivalent, Daisuke Sakaguchi, who once lent his vocal range to what would eventually become the insidious screams of Sunohara in Clannad. This fact makes his distinction as a non-Isshiki Isshiki especially troubling to me, as it was, apparently, also troubling to the series' character designer and chief animation director, Futoshi Nishia, whom, as some of you may recall, was a key member in Nichijo's creative development. In an interview, which I thankfully don't have to translate for myself this time, but which I nonetheless fact-checked by reading in Japanese anyway, Nishia said some very telling things about Hyouka's four main characters, and how they ought to be seen. But perhaps most informative of all was Nishia's response when asked if there were any particular characters in Hyouka that he recommended audiences keep an eye on. On the whole, I would like you to look at the changes that take place within Hotoro and the others as the story goes on, with special attention given to Satoshi, who is the toughest nut to crack among them. Describing Satoshi Fukabe as the toughest nut to crack makes a lot more sense when paired with what else Futoshi Nishia said about Fukabe's character earlier in the interview, when describing his character design process for each of the four leads. As for Satoshi, he's a cynic and a joker. Spiky and light short hair is fitting, isn't it? He's also surprisingly short, more or less around Eru's height. Satoshi bears all sorts of emotions inside, but I aimed not to let them show and to draw him cheerful on the outside. These carefully considered aspects of Fukabe's character are on full display in the series itself from the moment he enters the fray. Every move Fukabe makes is exactly in line with what the descriptions of the novels would have you expect going into the anime after reading the source material.
Oh no! I broke my Saturn!
We needed to retread old ground explaining for a second time why that is, but if you've been following along, I trust you've already come to a proper understanding of the character. Thus, in penultimate conclusion, the Isshiki of Hyouka is an Isshiki in grandiose facade, which is fine because that's exactly who Satoshi Fukabe really is. An actor. It makes his portrayal within the series a great and profound one, though it does very nearly disqualify him from Isshiki status entirely, only not doing so because of how much he looks like an Isshiki, and because he shared a Japanese voice actor with Sunohara, a trait which functionally provides him with an Isshiki-branded get-out-of-jail-free card, as well as a Death Note's ancient guarantee that he will one day fall into obscurity and secondary importance relative to the rest of the show's cast. He also rejected a girl who had romantic feelings for him, an action which will be earning him no favors in the court of Isshiki authentication. And thus, with the pounding of the gavel, I, both judge and jury, conclude that Satoshi Fukabe is a liar, and I sentence him to the lowest rank on the Isshiki totem pole, where he will probably stay until KYOTO anime show sputters, chokes, and dies. Let this be a lesson to you all. A good character does not a good Isshiki make, and Satoshi Fukabe is a fraud. Each of Hyouka's four main characters are animated with at least as much attention to detail as Oreki and Fukabe are, which is something taken directly from the careful prose with which the novels describe their actions. Consequently, Hyouka feels like the kind of program that only KYOTO Animation could possibly do justice to. A big part of why I consistently call it the most KYOTO Animation show, in contrast to Nichijou.
Truthfully, however, that isn't the reason KYOTO Animation animated Hyouka in the first place. They did it because someone high up on the KYOTO Animation totem pole read the novels and enjoyed them enough to want to adapt them into an anime. That person then hand-selected a group of individuals and held tryouts for key staff positions, a process which was internally called auditions. Of those selected to participate in the auditions, very few of KYOTO Animation's staff actually started out wanting to work on the show, and those few who did supposedly accounted for none of the people who were eventually handed the keys to the series. That is, of course, until they read the novels themselves, at which point it appears the attitudes of the animation team were slowly swayed in KOTENBU's favor. The apparent quality presented within their pages was enough to win over the series animation director and character designer Futoshi Nishia, who said of the process, quote, "I had initially braced myself when I heard the story would be a youth mystery, but once I actually started the novel, it was a breeze to read. The more volumes I finished, the clearer each of the classic club members' personality became, and before I realized it, I was hooked. Obviously, the segments where they solve everyday mysteries are entertaining, but it's each character's charm that really pulls you in, which is why I considered the designs to be of great importance. That said, how much of a difference there really is between the books and the series in the end proved rather negligible, much to the detriment of my Amazon.jp shopping habits and my script writing process. If you read the novels in Japanese, you will understand why the anime is called Hyouka and not called KOTENBU. Though I can, at the very least, promise you now that if you stick around until the video's conclusion, the solution to that particular mystery will inevitably be revealed regardless, I can also promise that the answer won't have anything to do with the contents of the books themselves. They are, from my perspective at least, competently written. More than competent, I believe they are expertly crafted. It's easier to read about this kind of thing, this gentle mystery-solving crew, than it is to watch it, in the sense that it requires a lot more focus and imagination to experience the narrative that way, and as a result of your own imagination and the verbal flow of words on the page, you will, by the end, have presumably formed the type of bond with it that can only truly be forged when you're reading or playing something, rather than simply watching or looking at it. I want to emphasize that I enjoyed reading these novels. I enjoyed them enough that I'm currently looking into continuing my journey with Book 5 as of the time of me writing this, but the books and the anime may as well be interchangeable for the most part, and considering the effort I put into reading them, I can't exactly recommend the novel reading experience to English-only speakers unless you're determined to read them for yourself. And even then, you should probably study Japanese at least a little bit first. That, or you could just read The Miracles of Namiya General Store by Keigo Higashino, which actually has been officially translated into English. You won't learn anything about Hyouka by doing this, I just think it's a good novel, and that if you're the type of person who enjoys Hyouka, you're probably also the type of person who would enjoy the works of Keigo Higashino. Reading, in other words, is an enjoyable pastime. And I feel that the experience of improving my reading comprehension in Japanese was a worthwhile experience in and of itself, regardless of whether or not it made the experience of watching Hyouka any different. Speaking quite frankly, it didn't. And because it didn't, the me who had panicked all summer in the heat of the sun, desperately deciphering Japanese characters like an amateur historian fails to decipher already professionally deciphered hieroglyphics in the Egyptian pyramids in an effort to prove to themselves that all those years studying Egyptian history probably meant something, that me had a panic attack on September 23rd, 2024. My hands shook, and my head erupted in frantic ramblings that I simultaneously could and could not convince myself had anything to do with KYOTO Animation's Hyouka. It was then that I realized something very important. Reviewing Nichijou was easy. Reviewing Hyouka is hard. I realized then that Hyouka's former subtitle didn't stop at the door. It came in. Like a flood, it had washed over me. It had begun to work its magic on me. And I knew then that no matter what I wanted this review to be, no matter what I wanted my relationship with Hyouka to be, that I would not receive what I wanted. I realized that Hyouka would not let me decide what it meant to me. Hyouka looked me in the eyes, and Hyouka
saw right through my tricks. Hyouka's anime adaptation powerfully captured my soul, and when it did, it told me calmly and coldly, "You can't escape." Only this time, it added another word into the end in my mind's eye. As I screamed into my pillow, my mind overflowed with everything my middle school self had failed to be. Every spot that mattered to me then that no longer exists. Every house that rose from the dust and debris of a field I used to run through. Every mistake. Every memory I wished I could erase from my middle school days. When I woke up 3 hours later and left to pick up my wife from work, I understood for the first time what that final additional word was, and what it meant. In the end, you can't escape yourself. If you're living that part of your life right now, the part where you choose to quote-unquote conserve your energy, you can't possibly understand what I mean. If you could, you wouldn't be choosing to conserve it, and you wouldn't be one of the popular kids either. You'd be in the gym with the other nerds, playing Super Smash Bros. Melee, or Magic the Gathering, or Dungeons and Dragons, or WeCross. You'd be doing it proudly instead of with a lingering sense of fear that you aren't good enough and that this isn't the best thing to be doing with your time. Because it is the best thing you could be doing with your time. It's the best thing you could be doing with your time because it matters to you, and because you chose to do it without someone else telling you you should. It's the best thing you could be doing with your time because you enjoy spending your time doing it. And if you're doing that, Hyouka won't be relatable to you anymore. And that is precisely why I said some 40-odd minutes in an Isshiki section ago that if you think Hyouka is boring, it's either because you think your own life is boring, or it's because life has already taken you to places you consider to be much more objectively interesting than your school library. You can't escape yourself. And if that doesn't mean something to you, that's because you don't live the kind of life that you might one day want to escape from. Wow, that was kind of scary, actually. Man, is it just me, or are these long-winded personal rant segments getting worse? Or better? I suppose now that that's done, we know assuredly and with arguable definiteness that Hyouka is about more than just a bedraggled group of high schoolers and their various mystery-solving escapades, which, contrary to any and all expectations, never dare to devolve into skylarking. What exactly that something more is, I shall not at this moment say, but I suspect as I sit in my own school's library that you may already be beginning to understand it for yourself. Hold on to that feeling. Hold it close. Now drop it onto the floor. We'll come back for it later. This section of the review is one that I considered getting rid of entirely, being honest with you, or just making it into its own video, but I'm leaving it here so it can be seen in its original context. It might get uploaded anyway as a separate Octo's Corner episode, mostly because I think the story contained within it is interesting. But before I let you jump into it, let me explain why I decided to include it in the first place, because that is something that, surprisingly, I neglected to mention in the original video. Actually, come to think of it, I originally did make mention of it in the first draft of this script, and a lot of the stuff that was cut was stuff that I removed during the process of making the second draft. This is why, by the way, I only write one draft most of the time. It's to avoid mistakes like this one. Anyway, Hyouka is, on the surface, about solving mysteries that are small and self-contained, which seem to have nothing to do with anything. Over the course of Hyouka's run, however, these seemingly disparate stories become seamlessly intertwined with Hyouka's cast, and they begin to teach each of the characters important things about themselves. To fully immerse myself in Hyouka's themes and understand the way something like that happens to a person, I thought it would be fun to solve a school mystery of my very own, one that only mattered to my wife and I. Therefore, as you watch Chapter 3, which I entitled The Songs That Trash Can Wrote, Keep in mind that I am attempting here a ludonarrative harmony of sorts. I am attempting here to bridge the gap between watching something like Hyouka and living it. It was around this point that my relationship with Hyouka as a series became fully parasocial. This is also the moment I began fully connecting the themes of regret into the video. In a lot of ways, the Nichijou review was about change. And this one, Hyouka, I think, is about regret. This section is where I started dropping hints that that's where this is all going, and that I'm going to try to overcome it. There's also a lot of personal details, so I cut a lot of those out for my own sake. Don't get me wrong, it is definitely still personal, but there's being personal and vulnerable, and then there's things that the strangers on the internet probably shouldn't know about me. So, hopefully this section feels a little more like it fits now.
Floyd Collins died in a cave on February 13th, 1925. Exactly 97 years and 337 days later, on January 17th, 2023, my then-fiancé found a sticky note in a trash can that read, "Floyd Collins Inspo" on it. At the time, Floyd Collins had enjoyed the kind of resurgence of popularity that only a Mental Floss article edited in the style of an internet historian video and featuring a beloved icon of casual folklore vibes and spooky campfire stories could ascertain. My then-fiancé occupied at the time the unenviable position of dust-cleaning ninja and part-time Luigi's Mansion cosplay artist at her local college campus. The same campus whose library I've commandeered for the sake of this video. This sticky note probably would not have mattered in the slightest, were it not for the fact that as the early hour pre-risen sun and its invisible rays grazed her massive vacuum backpack, which we believe still casts a Metal Gear-style phantom pain over her shoulders and upper back to this day, McKenna saw fit to remember exactly where she was standing at the time the note had unceremoniously caught her eye. The note, you see, and its cool yellow glow both foreshadowed the coming of an overcast sky that late winter's day with a stain, probably from coffee, cocoa, or whiskey, a drink professors were not allowed to have on the premises, which everyone who's ever worked as a school janitor for a college knows that they stashed somewhere anyway. And something far more thought-provoking as a result of, as implied, its location of discovery. Owing to either the stain or the lingering sticky of the ill-fated note and its musings of a Floyd Collins-inspired something or other, it had come to rest on the edge of the room's scenic trash can rather than on the inside of it. A scenic trash can which happened to be located in the office of a professor of musical theater. This created, instantaneously in McKenna's mind, a curious internal image, which she saw fit to text me about at 6 o'clock in the morning. What if someone at the school was planning to do a Floyd Collins musical? There are few things more worthy of a 6 a.m. text message than the prospect of a Floyd Collins musical happening exactly on the line between amateur theater and productional professionality, let alone one that might be happening locally. As such, my fiancé and I waited with bated breath at the prospect of the theoretical musical theater event of our collective lifetime. Then we got married. Then, sometime after we had gotten married, the discovery of a poster in the art building informed us both that the sticky story we often joked about as a newlywed couple wasn't so far-fetched as we'd previously believed. Floyd Collins, the musical, was happening, and it was happening nearby. As we sat down to watch the show, I turned to my wife and spoke unto her the exact details of a sudden epiphany I'd had just moments prior that had filled me with an odd sort of primordial terror and deep anxiety. What if the songs are really good and we never get to hear them again? I've been the recipient of 2 conditions over the course of my life that have made the idea of memories, of experiences, more cherished to me than to most. Beyond these 2 conditions, which I'll divulge momentarily, I've also possessed a peculiarly strong visual memory since I was a child, to such a degree, in fact, that I can still vividly remember certain aspects of my time in the single digits in photographic detail. I can't necessarily choose what it is that I remember this way.
I don't have an officially recognized condition, and believe me, I don't have a photographic memory. It's just that what I can recall is either completely visible as an explorable space in my head, or it's as though it never existed in the first place. For example, my first winter's day, the first memory I have of comprehending what the season meant. I was wearing a little oversized t-shirt, and I was at my old house. The second one, not the one I was born in, not the one I grew up in, just the one I spent my second 3 years in. I remember exactly what the world looked like to me as I gazed excitedly out of the frosted window at the still falling snow. I remember that I was standing on an old couch, because no matter how much time passes, my father still refuses to put the family's only television anywhere but exactly opposite of the largest window he can find, because glare only happens while the sun is up and Dad watches TV after dark. So on a couch with a window behind it, I watched the snow fall. And if I could, I could even tell you exactly how it sounded when I yelled at the top of my lungs back at my mother in the kitchen, "It's almost Christmas!" My grandfather, in our then small town, owned a tractor which would one day teach me to drive a stick shift in the field. Every winter, his red, now bygone era farmall would plow snow off the roads of our town at 6 total miles an hour, what felt like lightning speed to a kid who's only about 16 inches tall. My memory doesn't extend to numbers, by the way. I chose 16 because it had 6 in it, and 6 feet was too big, and 6 inches is like way too small to be feasible for a child's actual height. I realize this memory isn't likely peculiar to you unless you don't have a visual memory, but nonetheless, it's been peculiar to me, and as such, I relay it to you. I bring this up before mentioning the following 2 conditions for reasons you'll soon discover. The first condition is auditory synesthesia. I hear colors. I never realized, at least not until meeting my wife, that this is something not everyone experiences. For this reason, I recall music and musical tones to an oddly specific degree. Songs with especially vibrant colors, the chorus of Echo Smith's Lose Somebody and its icy blues and lighter whites above a sea of indigo waves, or the citrus orange tint of an acoustic guitar. I worried, as we entered the school's play to watch a performance we would likely never see or hear again, that the colors might be beautiful to me. That I would spend the rest of my life trying to keep alive the memory of my favorite song that doesn't exist. I didn't worry that I'd forget this theoretical song. I only worried that I'd only ever hear it play again in my head. Or worse, that I'd hear it in my dreams one day, years later, that it would matter there, but never again the moment I woke up. Lucid dreaming, by the way, is the second condition. As both of these conditions haunted my mind, McKenna held my hand and we watched the lights go dim and the show begin. Hilariously obvious was the fact that not everyone who was watching the play knew exactly how Floyd Collins' tale really ended. During intermissions, they murmured that he would surely make it out of the cave eventually. They asked what the point was going to be, if he was just going to die down there in the end. The point is that it's a true story. Not everyone makes it out of the cave alive. The point is that people cared about Floyd, that his discovery did for him exactly what he believed it would. The cave really did make him famous in the end. I wonder what he thought about for all that time in the dark. I wonder if he walked in his dreams. I hope he did. I hope he could at least walk in his mind at the end. I was stuck once. I realize, in talking about these memories I had hoped to keep buried, that instant regret isn't always how things play out. You don't always understand that you've done something that you can't undo in the moment that it happens. 1 second you have a car, and the next it's a ball of aluminum, flaming and in pieces flying down the highway at a blinding speed. 1 second you're free, the next you're staring at a line that you can't reach. learning just how cold a sunny day can really be when you're trapped in the shade. One minute you're walking, the next you're falling into a blue abyss that you don't understand. You only regret these kind of decisions, the kind that put you there, the kind of person you were to get there, in hindsight. I'm not talking about childhood when I say that, of course, but I'm willing to bet that you already know I've been talking about Hyouka, Floyd Collins, and my middle school days this entire time. As I watched a college-aged actor play the role of Floyd Collins, I understood, both metaphorically and literally, the feeling of being stuck. Stuck to the side of a trash can in a music room, stuck to the underside of a motorhome, stuck in an archetype you know deep down you don't want to play anymore. I have such profound regret for my time in middle and high school, and if I don't let that go, I'll always be stuck. I'll always be just like Floyd. The songs in Floyd Collins were great, of course, and as McKenna and I drove home from the show at its conclusion, we wondered if we'd ever hear their tunes again. I wondered again what it was about watching Hyouka that dug under my skin so much, and why it was that I couldn't put it into words. Like the Classic Literature Club and its energetic bundle of wholesome curiosity, I became consumed with a need to know. In my head, I saw myself, in all stages of life I've lived until now, drawn in the style of a KYOTO animation character, say with bated breath, I had to know more about this, about everything. So I kept digging, obsessively searching for something that would put these three curiosities in order, something that would make it all make sense to me. In English, we might translate Hyouka as shaved ice or ice cream. This translation is integral to the entire thesis point of the series. When the first true mystery, the overarching identity of Chitanda's uncle and his role in the school's past, becomes known, the crew and their curiosities are satiated temporarily by that exact translation. Ice cream. Hyouka means ice cream. Ice cream. I scream. To be devoured whole. I call this section the songs the trash can wrote, because I wholeheartedly believed the picture of a sticky note which sat on the edge of a music teacher's trash can. I believed that the Floyd Collins musical was produced entirely locally. As my deliberate use of tenses may already have divulged to you, this is not the only trash can with Floyd Collins inspo written on its legacy. As promised earlier, I did in fact find myself solving a mystery over the course of this review. A small, non-germane riddle that I'm willing to bet may one day itself be reviewed as the kind of thing that, quote-unquote, nobody cares about, but that left me saying to myself and my wife that I must know, and that I, with a smile on my face, sleuthed out of the cave this particular story has lodged itself into. Let's talk about Tina Landau and Adam Gattal. Let's talk about the mystery of the Floyd Collins musical. More than anything else, let's talk about the songs the trash can wrote. The Floyd Collins musical first appeared off-Broadway in 1996 from creators Tina Landau and Adam Gattal. As for the question of what about a story like Floyd Collins's inspired a musical of all things, Landau made that very clear when she spoke to the Los Angeles Times in 1999. She said that what drew them both in was that an image haunted them. Despite the film adaptation of Collins' tale, 1951's Ace in the Hole already having painted the reporter as the hero of sorts, Landau and Gattal were drawn to Floyd himself, to the image, as Landau put it, of simply a man trapped. What interested us is a man who believes he has the luck, who thinks he's going to live forever, facing his death, I find myself now in a unique position to understand exactly why that is. I understand why the feeling of being irreversibly stuck in something didn't come from Tina Landau herself. It came from Adam Gattal. I know that definitively without having to ask about it because I know who Adam Gattal's grandfather was. And I know what that did to him. Adam Gattal's grandfather was Richard Rodgers. The Sound of Music, Victory at Sea, that Richard Rodgers. For people born after the 1950s, that's like being related by blood to Lin-Manuel Miranda, except it's actually worse. Because Richard Rodgers didn't write subpar neo-dork hip-hop tracks for grease-filled Disney cash grabs. Miranda's kin can listen to Scuttlebutt if they want to feel like it's okay to make mistakes. Richard Rodgers is not who you want to be competing with. I'd feel stuck if my grandpa was that famous. Notice I said famous because my grandpa was totally as cool as Richard Rodgers. He just wasn't famous. Like, if you guys knew who my grandpa was, I wouldn't dare try to compete with that image. Wow, no wonder Adam Gattal wanted nothing to do with musical theater. About halfway through writing the show, he decided to make it a musical, though. That was a big step for him, and that, in a way, represented Adam Gattal getting himself unstuck. That was him not running away from the bed like it's the piano in Super Mario 64 and instead choosing to lie in it every once in a while. There's a lot of that feeling of being haunted or stuck in the final musical, I think. That's why you get lines comparing religious sacrifice to diving into a pool as kids. Why you get voices calling back to you in the dark as a metaphor for God or angels. You can do so much with a cave. But you can't do what Adam Gattal did unless you understand what it feels like to be stuck under something that momentous, of that terrible magnitude. I like stories set in caves. I like Pixel's Doukutsu Monogatari. I like Tim Schafer's The Cave. I think Tim Schafer is, well, I suppose anybody who knows video games already knows that Tim Schafer may as well be the Richard Rodgers of video game writers, or at the very least of adventure games. If Hideo Kojima is God, Tim Schafer is a biblically accurate angel. It's not Tim Fallon. Just cut Tim Fallon out and put Tim Schafer in. That was stupid. Also, if you're gonna play The Cave, play it on Wii U. It doesn't matter why, and I don't care what you have to do to get it running that way. Just do it. Make it happen. I played that game once. Only once. And it was on a Wii U, and I was at my friend's house, and he was like,
Man, this game's weird.
and I said, yeah. And he said,
You want to play Super Smash Brothers?
and I said, no way, dude. I like weird. Mitchell, if you're watching this, I'm sorry about switching schools last minute. That decision had nothing to do with you. Give me a call sometime. Let's get burgers or something. And we played Super Smash Brothers. And I thought for years that The Cave was really good, or at least really interesting, and now not only do I know who made it, but I know that it definitely was good, and that I was right. Weird is good. I like weird. You could say a lot about Knit Underground, or Cave Story, Kero Blaster. You can say a lot about them. But you can't say they understand what facing your own decisions really feels like, because they don't ask you to. The fact that there are two things that I'm talking about here that do ask you to, and that one of them is the Floyd Collins musical, and that neither of them are Puella Magi Madoka Magica, I think that says it all, really. My favorite
Adam Gittal wrote, and it's 8 minutes long. It's called The Riddle Song. And it is everything I've been trying to say this entire time. But finding the song wasn't the end of the mystery. How could it be? Sure, there's musical recordings, there's an answer to why it was so good and why the school performed it, but there's still one question. Where did the Floyd Collins inspo actually come from? I dug deeper into the cave and something called back. Something from the abyss screamed at me. Loud and fierce, like that time I heard a lion roar in person, and it sounded like it had blown out the speakers of life itself. That's when I learned that this video had a time limit. When Eruchitanda sat Hotaru Oreki down at a restaurant they both perceived wildly differently, I never imagined that it would someday mirror my wife and I sitting across from each other at a kitchen table, discussing, of all things, the Floyd Collins musical. Hyouka's entire first arc had a time limit. Hyouka itself had a time limit. I guess now that City exists, I realize that my Nichijou video had a time limit too. In 2025, Adam Gittal is bringing Floyd Collins to Broadway. And with it, the musical is soon to become as common knowledge as knowledge can common become. Maybe I failed. Maybe you already knew this musical, where it came from, and why. Maybe I simply wasn't fast enough to be the one to unravel this mystery before the funeral. Except that I can promise you that I know the truth. You're going to hear in 2025, when Floyd Collins goes Broadway, that the inspiration for the musical came from a book. That the book was a compendium of sorts, a volume on life in America, and I'm going to laugh because I know what that book is, and I know when it was published. When an older Adam Gittal relays the phrase, Death Watch Carnival, I'm going to smile because I know what that means. Death Watch Carnival is the name of a Reader's Digest story, not an article. And it wasn't in a book called Reader's Digest, Amazing American Stories, as Tina Lindau claims, but in one with the much more humble title of Strange Stories, Amazing Facts of America's Past, which contains over 600 collected stories by multitudes of authors and is merely presented by Reader's Digest. And you want to know how I know that? Because I found it. It's right here. In every interview, every article from the 90s, I scoured the words until my eyes grew tired and my vision blurred. I clawed like a rat in a mousetrap, like a man desperate to get out of the cave. I didn't understand why this answer mattered, why Death Watch Carnival meant so much to me. I guess because it meant so much to them. I just realized at one point when I saw Death Watch Carnival in writing in an article about the musical's history, and when I discovered that whatever it was had meant so much to Adam Gittal and Tina Landau, that they so consistently insisted that the musical's original title had been Death Watch Carnival, a title by which neither McKenna nor myself would have recognized it, and which would have not resulted in 2 extra ticket sales on the literal final performance of closing night, and McKenna and I hearing and loving the riddle song. I realized in that moment, I had to know. And now I do. This review's keyframe was originally supposed to be that Hyouka is, and I quote, a YouTube rabbit hole that only you care about. I think, though, that in this moment you as well as I can see a bit clearer than that, because I solved a rabbit hole mystery of my own at school, and as awesome as that felt to do, as fulfilling an experience as it was, Hyouka still had its hooks in me by that mystery's conclusion. A surface-level reading will tell you that people care about a lot of things. A man who died in a cave, for example. An uncharacteristically aggressive dismissal of an innocent question. A book called Hyouka, something that actually was unique to their school, written by Oreki's long-past peers and containing, among other things, a lost essay on focus and a sequel to H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds.
That book is full of nothing but forgotten old things, the deeper you peer into it. Sure, I can sit here and lie to you. I can tell you Hyouka's about solving mysteries if that's what you want to hear. We can say the key frame is that Hyouka is a rabbit hole only you care about. We can pack up and I can go home. I can lie and tell you Hyouka's just another lo-fi mystery. But it isn't. It really, genuinely isn't. And if we're gonna go in that direction anyway, the best mystery is Gusha no End Roll, the Fool's End Credits. Just on the basis of that fact alone, I'm not going to be the fool who rolls his end credits here. I'm going to stop running in place. I'm going to get unstuck. Because if I really want to understand Hyouka, I'm going to have to get myself out of this cave.
For his fortune under the ground. Sure enough, his fortune is what he found.
The end of the previous segment to me represented a rejection of the thought that I could write this video without much effort, recap the series as it is, and avoid completely any sort of personal analysis. Before writing anything down at all for this pseudo-review, pseudo-personal anecdote nonsense, I believed with a full heart that that was exactly and exclusively what I was going to do. I suspected that I would write for 1 hour and 1 30-minute half about how Hyouka is a forgotten KYOTO animation byproduct, recap some things about it I thought were interesting, and then put it out there. I wrote a lot of script about that at first. I deleted all of it. I had no idea how to talk about Hyouka, and to do it right by its fans, largely because, though I searched high and low, I could not see any of what its fans saw in it that was any different from what you might see in something like Clannad or K-On! Hyouka is more sad than K-On!, but it's not sad enough to be KYOTO Animation's great tragedy series. It kinda... Well, I don't want to say Hyouka sucks, but that's how I felt about it at the time, and that made it very hard to want to talk about it. I guess you could say that the truth of it is that I felt uncomfortable with the fact that I didn't get Hyouka at all, and that no amount of deep personal digging helped me get it. This bothered me a lot, and over the course of the last 2 chapters of this video, I've done my best to showcase that journey without being honest about why any of it was happening. That was me not explaining myself in a way that I think was a mistake, because it meant that anybody who did, quote-unquote, get Hyouka the first time was going to feel very upset with me. They were probably going to disagree with me. And they did. I figured they were right to disagree with me, which is why I took down the video in the first place, because after all of this, I still wasn't sure what Hyouka itself actually meant to the general anime fandom. I was only successful in finding out what it meant to me. I'm gonna say it here because I realize now that I've never put it anywhere else, but this is not a definitive analysis or objective retrospective. Neither, really, was the Nichijou video, but this one was even less so. And it was presented with a sort of snarky, holier-than-thou confidence that I think sent the wrong message. I think it was a little bit egotistical to say what I said in the way that I said it. So, I guess what I'm saying is that I hope you don't think I'm trauma dumping here when I say what I'm about to say in this next chapter. I just finally understood, after a lot of desperate attempts, what Hyouka means to me. I had come out of the cave understanding why Hyouka bothered me so much to watch. And that's what this next section is about. This next section is where I actually tried to review Hyouka for a little while and stopped trying to avoid talking about it like it was the piano in Mario 64. This is the part where I tried to tie it all back together and make this mess cohesive. I'm still not sure, even with this post-mortem bonus content, that I've been able to do so, but I do think I was able to stay true to my own motto, and in so doing break free of Hotaru Orikis. I wrote what I wanted to write, instead of what I had been assigned to write. The amount of effort it took to get to that point and figure out why Hyouka bothered me should be evident, based on what you've seen up till now, but just in case it isn't, let's rename this video. Let's call it My Journey to Understand What Hyouka Means to Me. Not to anybody else, just me. So, if you disagree, and especially if you disagree, I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time with something so long and so personal if that wasn't what you were looking for. In the end, I think, and especially with this chapter, I've showcased the power of anime to mean something to someone, to hit them hard at the exact moment that it matters most. So, hopefully me talking at least a little bit about Hyouka, the anime, from here on out is worth something. Hopefully it makes sense why it took until now for me to actually watch the show again and talk about it. I knew I couldn't just call it a day, and that I did in fact need to watch and analyze the whole thing all the way through to the end and figure out what I thought it meant. I especially knew, after the Madoka video's mixed reception, that it couldn't be the same thing that everyone else was saying it meant. But that was fine, because I couldn't understand what everyone else was saying it meant anyway.
Was it right for Chitanda to drag Hotaro into her problems like that? Like, I know it seems unrelated, but it's kind of an important question, isn't it? Like, really, was it inherently wrong of Chitanda to just assume Hotaru Oreki wanted anything to do with her? He did, of course, but that doesn't necessarily make it her right to decide that for him, does it? The argument, and the one that gets reinforced by the series over its runtime, is that Oreki needed Chitanda. That he needed that sort of structure in his life because he wasn't going to do anything with it on his own. That's what his older sister says about it anyway. And maybe it's true. Maybe Hotaru Oreki needed someone to push his bubble until it popped so that he could learn what he was missing by hiding behind the so-called little black cloud and finally begin to experience his own life, as Satoshi Fukabe wonders on a particularly memorable sequence involving a midnight stroll under the full moon. Worth noting about the scene itself is that the clouds have not fully dissipated. Even now, as Hotaro's own ki ni narimasu has begun to take root in various ways over the course of the school's Kanyasai or Kanya Festa, as is written in the to-be-continued stand-in text during the arc. Satoshi Fukabe wonders what that could mean for himself. As an Isshiki, as a side character, he has begun to become self-aware. Satoshi Fukabe sees Hotaro's personal growth as a threat to his own. But nonetheless, and with the size of a 31-year-old reading the 30 under 30 list and finding their name not present, reduces this particular question down to its most basic of answers by hypothesizing that Chitanda's intervention has brought Hotaru Oreki out of his rainy echo chamber, that she's awakened his latent potential, and that Oreki's latent potential may be greater than his own. But there's much more to it than just that, isn't there? It's made clear, in the anime at least, that Hotaru Oreki is deeply interested in Chitanda. Chitanda and Hotaru Oreki are absolutely intended to be each other's romantic interests.
Why don't you just ignore her?
She's not someone I can easily ignore. Trust me, I would.
In the end, I wasn't sure, and I'm still not. I don't think that aspect of the series is something Hyouka itself is interested in exploring. Probably because if you really want to explore that concept, KYOTO Animation offers at least 6 other discussions about that, and 3 of them that are intrinsically connected to that topic as a through line. One of them ends with marriage, one of them ends with a bird, and one of them is the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, so we can talk about that some other time. I did, however, think that Hyouka's particular take on the idea was interesting enough that it at least bears mentioning and bears opening up for discussion, because, I mean, we've been here for hours now. If I was going to find an answer for that on my own, I probably would have found it already. My middle school days tell me that
The person who structured and planned my daily schedule didn't do it out of malice, and in the end, that was beneficial to my development, as at the very least a semi-functional human being in terms of social interaction and general understanding of my surroundings. But the question of whether or not it's Eruchi Tanda's place to do that, as opposed to Fuyumi, the Empress Irisu, the girl who has both those eyes and that hair, whose ultimately manipulative tactics do arguably the most pushing of Orochi's general character toward the exit of the prison of his own design, and of whom Chitanda asks advice in complimentary acknowledgement of those very manipulative tactics, I can't say. As a matter of fact, I don't even know if it's Orochi's sister's place to do that, and without her, Hyouka probably would have never happened at all. I don't know. All of this still falls in my mind into a kind of moral gray area. When I asked close personal friend and YouTube sensation Justice Z to weigh in on the subject, this is what he had to say. The key aspect of human nature is striving to find a purpose. If you can't find one yourself, then sure, let someone else find it for you. But once you've found it, or you have used it as a means to get you going and find something that you truly think is your purpose, find your own reason to do it. Don't get locked into what others tell you. Otherwise, it just becomes a pointless routine you don't really care about, and which no longer fulfills you. I asked Justin, of all people, because of something else he said once that I won't repeat here. Something that changed my outlook on life forever. This open-ended discussion ain't gonna cut it as the keyframe either. Not now, and not ever. The keyframe isn't something I decide before watching a show, even if I've seen it at least 2 or 3 times before. This is a thesis that finds me, not a label I can slap on a used car.
I'd buy that for $1.
No, you wouldn't. And neither would I. My emotional attachment to a series isn't something that could be put on flash sale and mass purchased like televisions on Black Friday. Neither are yours. Nor anyone's. Anyone can look at Hyouka and say it's about finding the motivation to change for the better. It's a story about realizing that your strong, silent archetype, cool, backseat-taking kid routine ain't doing it for you. That all that amounts to is a little black rain cloud over your head which keeps you stagnant like a frog pond of runoff water. Hotaru Orochi just doesn't want to do anything because he doesn't feel motivated to, in large part as a complete separation from any underlying conditions which may have tied his hands, or his tongue. Chitanda motivates him without actively attempting to because of the following 2 reasons. A, because she exerts boundless energy and yet never seems to run out, which goes completely against Orochi's entire MO. And B, because she's got them eyes, man. Hotaru Orochi, if those midnight sky eyes and their galaxies of stars have not cast some kind of spell on you, you need to get yours checked for cataracts.
Are you wearing a blindfold? Nah, but with these cataracts, I might as well be. What is that, a woodpecker?
Chitanda's eyes show more of her soul than an ecchi harem anime's beach episode shows skin. Speaking of skin, we could talk probably all day about the Hot Springs episodes and still not run out of things to say. The episode was extraordinarily controversial in Japan, by the way. It raised a lot of eyebrows for a variety of reasons, and KYOTO Animation knew it would. There's a whole bit in the interview where they talk about that and how they knew it was going to be a hot topic among fans, but that doesn't really matter. Obviously, all of this discussion ultimately boils down to one thing. We can search here all we want. We can talk about Hyouka as though it's about motivation. We can convince ourselves to fall for its biggest red herring, but we aren't going to find the keyframe that way either. These were the problems that consistently bothered me in the end. And when I watched and rewatched Hyouka and I still couldn't understand it, when it still poked and prodded me like I was a specimen in a scientist's septic tank, I realize now that I'd simply been running from the truth all along. I'd been trying to write another review that was like the Nichijou review, and that isn't what this review was ever going to be. Hyouka isn't about change. And if it is, then it isn't about it the same way that Nichijou was. The answer to the riddle isn't that easy. I know the answer to the riddle, and it sure as heck ain't the quarry. That feeling from earlier, the one I told you to drop, the one we'd come back for, it's already back, even if you didn't drop it. It always comes back. It haunts you like a ghost, grows on you like mold on an unclean shower curtain. It curdles like milk in the back of your mind while you try to pretend it isn't there. I realized what it was while listening to a playlist of songs I put together that reminded me of Hyouka more than either of its openings or endings do. Those songs are fantastic, by the way. Chocho's Yasashisa no Ryu is one of my favorite songs of all time. It just doesn't quite capture the true essence of what Hyouka really is, I don't think. That's not to say it doesn't try either. The lyrics are good, visuals are superb, but Tada Kimi ni Hare by Yorushika, on the other hand, would have made for a much more effective first opening. And any song would have probably made for a better second opening, though really the second opening to Hyouka is an effective abridgment of the entire show anyway. You could watch that instead of the second half of Hyouka, and you'd still understand Hotaru Oraki and what the series wants us to feel about him, as though you'd read it from the pages of the novels themselves. The second opening of Hyouka is one of the most effective opening animations for thematics and character expression I've ever seen. So maybe I'm just talking out of my hat here, but I'd really rather not hear that obnoxious squeaking noise every time an episode starts. Which winds up leaving me conflicted on what is otherwise one of the best anime openings of all time, and number 26 in my personal top 100 anime openings lists. It's right up there with Violet Evergarden's opening in the Kyo no Kyoto Anime Show Anime OP Hall of Worthwhile Recognition. Nonetheless, when I think about music in Hyouka, I don't think about Yasashisa no Ryu. I think a song by an artist like Chocho could never hope to capture what I like about the series, or even anything at all close to what it means on its own merits. Yasashisa no Ryu is a song about Eru Chitanda. It sounds like it would be at the top of her personal playlist for while she studies. You can hear Chocho's smile in the lyrics. Hyouka isn't about smiling. It doesn't need the kind of header verse that makes you want to smile and relax like Yasashisa no Ryu does. It also doesn't necessarily need the kind of song that expresses profound guilt over the past either. Because Hyouka isn't about memories either. Hyouka's about the same thing Tada Kimi ni Hare is about. It's about the same thing the Riddle song is about. You can catch glimpses of it in everything Yorushika does, mostly because Yorushika is out here spitting piping hot bars of ice-cold truth like an oxymoronic batter hitting at 10,999 and oh. You want to talk about good music? About real good hits? Let's talk about Yorushika, about Dakara Boku wa Ongaku o Yameta, about Go-Go Vanillas, about Ohio Culture and Higher. I could talk to you about Higher all day. Let's talk about how good the cello suite sounds when the screen is bathed in sunset colors. The fact that you can smell the after-rain freshness in the air and feel the wind chill sometimes, just from hearing that and looking at this place the background artists have made. Dang, Takayama City, loosely disguised as the fictional Kamiyama City, you look good. Me likey. Some people think that the classical pieces are overused in Hyouka, and I disagree. I think they're used exactly where they want to be, and that they sound timeless. Because they are timeless. I could listen to Cello Suite forever. I doubt I'd ever get tired of it. It's easy to listen to. Hyouka's actual soundtrack is a step down, however, from timelessness. It's good enough, for what it's worth, and speaking on it because I doubt we'll find occasion to do so elsewhere, but it isn't Nichijou's soundtrack. It isn't Kobayashi's, and it isn't Clannad's. And it most certainly isn't Haruhi Suzumiya's either. That's why I made a playlist of my own to try and bottle up what Hyouka itself made me feel in the first place. A playlist of Yorushika and All Time Low and Go-Go Vanillas. A playlist that haunted me like a ghost for months before I finally, suddenly, and mercilessly felt a tug at my heart from the feeling I had been pushing away. And suddenly, I knew exactly what it all meant. I knew in that moment why I kept thinking about middle school when I thought about Hyouka. Why I was so haunted by visceral recreations of my past in the endless labyrinthine hallways of my mind. I know what I felt. I felt remorseful. I realized that I was burning. I burned for the words I never said about a painting of a red balloon over an open ocean. I burned for the support I didn't give my younger brother when he was growing and changing into the person he is now. I speak my mind now because I know it doesn't make me cool to pretend I don't care about the people around me, even if it's hard to talk to them or the words don't come out right. But I remember becoming an adult without ever feeling caught up. I remember that in your pocket bloomed all the flowers of the night. Shashin nante kamikire da. Omoide nante tada no gomi da. Sore ga wakaranai kara. Kuchi o tsugunda mama. In the lyrics of Tada Kimi ni Hare, Yorushika calls memories, omoide, trash. But I don't think that's really what she's saying when she says omoide nante tada no gomi da. I think what she means is that trash is the part we don't use. Trash is every container that's ever had food in it. It isn't the thing itself, just the wrapper for it. Trash piles up over time. It's a remnant. Trash is a piece of what was once something else, into the leftover shells of a good we've already used up. Memories, I think, in much the same way, serve as leftovers for especially important moments in our lives. Like hoarders, we collect them because we know we won't live forever. We want to keep with us the important things, and they are, in the end, important. A memory, however, isn't the experience itself. A memory is the afterimage the experience leaves behind. It isn't tangible. Yorushika doesn't argue that this philosophy applies to everything, and neither do I for that matter, but she does express lingering regret in the song, subtly telling us that a memory of laughing with a friend you wanted to be something more with isn't tangible. As listeners, we can infer that what she means by that is that it would have been better to say something to the person she loved rather than keep quiet for the sake of being able to make more memories with them as just friends. A memory is just a byproduct. The memory is nice and all, but it can't hold her hand now. She wishes she would have said something. Yorushika, with every word and every syllable, expresses in Tada Kimi ni Hare a sense of regret for her adolescence, and a resignation against letting that hold her back forever. In the end, I've realized that that's what Hyouka really is. A person can be who they need to be without getting lost in who they no longer are. That's what Hyouka really means. That's why it's not a happy slice-of-life show. That's why it hurts to watch for some people. It's not about the mysteries on the outside. It's about solving the one that's on the inside and learning to get past it. Hyouka is about learning to put in effort where you believe it ought to go, and understanding that it ought to go somewhere. I know that because the KOTENBU novels weren't the only books I read when making this video. I also read The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, Why Didn't They Ask Evans by Agatha Christie, and Elephants Can Remember by Agatha Christie, just to ensure the subtitles of each KOTENBU novel really don't have anything to do with the contents of the novels themselves beyond the arguable connective tissue of genre definition and the irony of a series which has Koten in the name, referencing works oft described as Koten themselves. Just to confirm with you, they do not. I read The Miracles of Namiya General Store by Keigo Higashino, looking to experience a Japanese novel whose mystery elements are much more grandiose and supernatural as a way to temporarily escape from the relaxed and subdued pace of the KOTENBU series and the classicness of the classic novels I have read before them. During that time, my health began to visibly decline, and I became extraordinarily exhausted. As the trees and their leaves began to lose themselves in the colors of blood, gold, and sunlight, I read Deborah and James Howe's Bunnicula, Rabbit Tale of Mystery, in Japanese to help rebuild my reading comprehension. I read Bakemonogatari Part 1 in English and Japanese immediately after. I read Alex Hirsch's The Book of Bill. Because I wanted to. Then I finally watched Owari Monogatari. I learned from that experience that the most beautiful equation in mathematics is Euler's identity, which states that e to the power of I multiplied by pi plus 1 equals 0, described by some as mathematical proof of God, a profound expression of inherent cosmic order. Further research into the matter proved to me what I already knew, that I don't understand math, and therefore cannot possibly begin to understand the relationship between this supposedly beautiful clump of numbers, letters, and Greek symbols, and the existence of God. For 2 weeks, I juggled schoolwork, freelance writing as a contractor for a reputable video games journalism outlet, animated Bibliomania where I could, worked as chief animation director and creative lead elsewhere, and recorded and attempted to edit my next Octo's Corner video, the one where I talked personally about Moon and how it made me feel. I got dizzy every time I stood up, and I could feel my health getting worse. And then one day, I completely broke down, and my wife took me to visit her parents for the weekend. She correctly assumed that getting me out of the house and away from the physical source of the stress I had been under would be good for me. Together, we watched Naoto Kine and Junichi Sato's 1995 anime feature, Junkers Come Here. We both rather enjoyed the film, smirking over the poor parenting skills of its lead protagonist's mother and father, and understanding the kind of stark loneliness that only excessive busyness can truly create. That weekend, I was honored to meet Nikki Rapp, voice of Lily in the Psychonauts games, and an all-around very pleasant individual. We talked about how good a game Psychonauts 2 is. I cooked New England darned chowder from the Necro Nom 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 Lovecraftian cookbook. I watched Richard Stanley's 2019 adaptation of Color Out of Space. To anyone who thinks my videos take a while, Richard Stanley's probably been on vacation from film production since before you were born. The most recent thing he did before Color Out of Space was get fired from the eternally cursed Island of Doctor Morose adaptation. Richard Stanley's Color Out of Space rules. Watching Richard Stanley's Color Out of Space while blissfully devouring a Lovecraftian clam chowder my wife and I cooked together ruled harder than, if I'm being honest, pretty much every other thing I've done this year, except maybe traveling to Kings Island and getting a pitch-black midnight ride on the Beast, a midday ride on the Voyage at Holiday World, Santa Claus, Indiana, and a pitch-black midnight ride on Ghost Rider at Knott's Berry Farm, all within the span of 1 week. I did that over the summer, but we can talk about roller coasters some other time. I went everywhere I could, and I stung like a wound under rubbing alcohol. And I cried, and I sobbed, and I broke down until there was nothing of me left. And it was at that exact moment that I understood that I couldn't escape myself. Hyouka wouldn't let me. And you know what? All of that regret is still important. It made me who I am today. I learned from every mistake. So yes, it may be that my memories are trash, but when I watched Hyouka, I realized all at once that the reason I love Hyouka now is because I can't relate to it. And the reason I didn't like it back then was because I could. You will never understand Hyouka until you stop being able to relate currently to its main character of Hotaru Oreki. You will never understand Hyouka until you've realized the depth of the regret you still have. And when that happens, Hyouka will pull you out of wherever it is you've been hiding, and Hyouka will make you scream and yell and sputter. You can't run from the rubble in the cave. You need to face these things, because it's only once you've faced them that you can take the next step forward. It's not enough to just not be afraid of changing. You need to face the version of yourself from before you changed at all, and you need to come to terms with why you feel about that person the way that you do. For me, that keyframe may as well be the song the trash can wrote. That keyframe is the meaning of the ducks in Central Park. Freedom. Hyouka is a look back on the regrets you never knew you had, and a celebration of the moments that taught you to leave them behind. Put another way, Hyouka is a springtime that has been drowned by the colors of fall. Genuinely speaking, watching Hyouka changed my life. Hyouka taught me that you can't escape yourself, that you can't escape your past. You can't escape your mistakes, and you shouldn't be able to. What you should do, what you can do, is learn from them. You can feel the hurt that Hyouka pushes onto you, and you can cry, and that's okay. Because once your tears dry, you'll feel better. You'll understand, finally understand, what you really need to do to move forward, and what it is that you're missing in life. Then, and only then, will you finally start feeling able to let the regrets of the past go. You'll realize that the past is over. Over and done with, corn boy. Maybe then, the past can finally start letting go of you too. I'd buy that for $1. And maybe you would too. Speaking of things I'd buy for $1, Hyouka's wide assortment of novelty goods and offerings offer up for emotional purchase a cruise ship's buffet of interesting rabbit holes which will occupy your critical thinking time for way longer than you're probably ready to offer up. Unlike Nichijou, Hyouka has not been the recipient of a video game adaptation to date, but there was a phone app where solving a puzzle would gift you a wallpaper for your phone. This was known as Link Game Hyouka. Not exactly making this easy on me, are you? In 2017, Hyouka received a live-action film adaptation in Japan, a film which you already know I couldn't stop myself from watching in preparation for this review. A film which is so small-scale and safe that it only barely warrants any kind of discussion. It's the exact kind of anime adaptation you'd expect from Japan, but what caught my eye about live-action Hyouka in particular was the amount of people in the comments of YouTube, where I initially found the film, as well as those in online discourse who described the film as passable. I, on the other hand, only made it 7 minutes and 40 seconds into the runtime before I realized that this movie was not going to be worth my time. I watched the rest of it anyway. If you want to talk about post-mortem regret, let's put it like this. I'd rewatch Angel's Egg's live-action adaptation, In the Aftermath, at least 7 times over before I'd be caught dead watching this film a second time. And do you want to know why? Because In the Aftermath has this. If you still want to know why, you really need to start paying attention when I'm talking to you, but I'll humor you just this once. Hyouka's live-action film takes pretty much all of its cues from the anime, something one particular commenter found worthy of enough praise to say, "Can we just appreciate the fact that there are some people in the industry who actually know a good anime plot to transform it into a movie?" First off, we're gonna need to remove the word "it" before we can get a good grasp on what they were trying to say here. Second, never use "the fact" to describe an opinion. Third, it is a fact that some people in the industry know good ways to transform anime plots into films. Just watch Ping Pong or 20th Century Boys, or my personal favorite big-budget Japanese live-action anime adaptation, Tokyo Ghoul. This is just not one of them. Fourth, Hyouka is absolutely not the kind of plot that works in live action, especially if you're trying to copy the anime with it. Everything about the rainy sunsets and constant golden hour visuals is completely absent from the film version. Hyouka's lush rainforest of overcast greens, the smell of fresh rain, and most troublesome of all, the accompaniment of the cello suite are all absent from this version of Hyouka. The very thematic importance of all of the original's visual language is completely abandoned by the film almost immediately. And you still think this is an example of high-effort adaptation and a specific vision for a film? Absolutely not. Buddy, Hyouka is right up there with Nichijou in terms of cumbersome adaptability. You absolutely cannot do any of the things that make the anime such a great visual treat in live action without getting somebody like Edgar Wright or whoever edited the first 2 Kingsman movies involved. Someone out there could probably filmify the artistic vision and pixel-perfect lighting. Someone could probably make that live action, and I wouldn't knock anybody for trying, but I can certainly knock this film, because from the moment the film opened on the driest, least interesting shot as any that I, in my 25 years of watching movies, have ever seen, I knew it wasn't trying. What I'm telling you isn't that Hyouka Forbidden Secrets is the worst live-action anime adaptation I've ever seen. It's not even that bad of a movie. It's just that it repeatedly asks its audience to remember how much better than it the anime adaptation had been. Hyouka the movie is very good at making me wish I was watching Hyouka the anime, because it has nothing that the anime hasn't. That is boring. It's still okay to like that movie if you do, I just need you to know that I will not be watching it ever again. A manga adaptation based on the anime started in 2012. A sequel series based on the novels started in 2019, and it finished, as of the time of me writing this, 1 year ago, in 2023. If you want to know how the story really ends, that's probably the most accessible way to find out, because it does tell the whole story. That's at least twice as much as I can tell you. Finally, Hyouka had a blood drive. Yes, it really did have a blood drive collaboration. Maybe we can talk about blood drives and blood in general when we talk about Beyond the Boundary one day. I kind of hope that I die before I have to talk about Beyond the Boundary. Part of me believed I was dying when I was working on this review. Part of me believes that I am now as I type this, afraid of my job and of school and of my wife's job and the health detriments of the kind of job where you are not allowed to sit down for 8 total hours. Part of me knows that we're all dying. All the time. That's probably why you can't buy quite as many goods for Hyouka as you can for Nichijou. Alrighty then, folks. Let's talk about this here review just a little bit more before we jump into this final segment. I'm going to do 2 things here in this section, though, just to try and defend myself one last time. The first one is actually try and talk about Hyouka for a little while. So, if you wanted to hear me talk about the anime in this video about the anime, this is where I think the most of that happens. I'm sorry it didn't end up happening more. It probably should have. But at the very least, it ended up happening here. So there were some aspects of review in here somewhere, both here and in the previous section a little bit. The second is that I'm going to try and tie it all back together to the themes of regret, original works of what some might call art, and finally answer the question that has been devouring me whole for this entire video. Where do I think my energy that I've been conserving ought to go? And why do I want to put it there? I feel this is a relevant question to ask myself when talking about Hyouka, because that, as I mentioned before, is what Hyouka and Hyouka's detractors, of which club you now know I am a card-carrying member, ask of its main character, Houtaro Oriki. My parasocial connection with Oriki, my existence in the halls of my mind staring back at him, this is where those 2 people staring at each other in the halls part ways. Because Oriki ultimately doesn't seem to decide what it is he wants. He can't bring himself to confess to Chitanda that he wants to be with her in the end of the series. And that bothers me, as well as a lot of other people, because it feels like he got so close to changing. He got so close to understanding that he regrets the way he spent his time up until now. He got so close to rectifying it. Houtaro Oriki was very nearly out of the cave, so to speak. But in those final moments of Hyouka, he can't quite do it. Me, on the other hand, not that I haven't been in situations where I couldn't do it before, but I left both him and Hyouka behind, right here. I realized, like Oriki has begun to, that I no longer wanted to be the person I have been. I look at Hotaru Oriki there in my mind, and I see nothing but my own regrets there, standing in front of me, like they have been from the very beginning of this video. Like they have been since I put that text there in the beginning that I imagined myself saying to Oriki in the halls at this precise moment. I raise my hand to wave goodbye to the fictional character that I so closely related to, and with this, I see myself. I see my regrets, and I see that I do not have to hold on to them. They will let go on their own, and when they do, I will let them fall. I don't know how that through line never once got mentioned here in the end of the review. Like, man, that was the whole point, was that Oriki and I were very similar people, and that by the end of my experience with Hyouka, we weren't anymore. How did I not say that? Anyway, I keep that whole slightly egotistical and self-absorbed story about me and Oriki in my mind in yours for this final chapter, and see if that helps make it a bit more clear what I was going for and what I'm talking about. I'm not really sure if it was a good idea to go for that angle in hindsight, but I am definitely sure that I, at the very least, should have told you that that was the angle I was going for, so I'm sorry that I never did. That's one more regret I think I can let go of with the release of this post-mortem edition, at least. I'll let you get back to the video now, and then when it's over, we can meet back up for one final little chat. Thanks for sticking with me all this time, by the way. I know it's been a really long ride and not as upbeat as the last one was, so hopefully this positive little outlook at the end can lead to this whole thing being a little bit less of a downer. And really, I do appreciate you giving this a shot and making it all the way here. It means a lot to me.
Let's talk about the second half of Hyouka for a little while. Let's start by talking about the Kanyasai arc, which is the most enjoyable part of the entire series, hands down. In the floods of familiarity which pour over us as we follow Hyouka's classic lit club into the Kanyasai, each and every member of our lead quartet is thrust into a unique kind of self-actualization and robust character growth, the likes of which KYOTO Animation, in their wisdom, have only seen fit to tease for us up until now. In this character arc boot camp, in its many colors and grandiose saturation, Eruchitanda shows the first signs that her boundless energy, a trait envied and meticulously pondered by Oriki, is not so boundless as she lets on. For reasons I do not see fit to explore here, I understand this feeling Eruchitanda feels all too well. I sigh and groan at the prospect of attempting to put in extracurricular work like Hotaru Oriki, only to become enamored with the hallways of delightful demonstrations of every kind, realizing in each instance that I haven't the time for this. I, too, forget myself in the seas of intrigue and their tide pools of recreational allure. At some point in that metaphysical hallway of my dreams, perhaps it wasn't Hotaru Oriki that I stood face to face with, but Eruchitanda, unknowingly lamenting to each other that we're getting worn out, that there's too much to see and never enough time to look at it all. Of course, in the grand scheme of things, Hyouka reminds us that there is something to that feeling, something we don't think about nearly enough. This is a literary balance that Hyouka never pays in full, an emotional debt we must all eventually discover has charged our hearts beyond their credit limits. All that is to say, I think it's good that Hyouka doesn't dwell on this too long once Chitanda conceals her cracked foundation with a cheerful,
I've had enough.
Hyouka doesn't need to focus on this moment any more than that. That moment, after all, is so perfectly representative of regret and emotional healing that there are no more words than those which could ever hope to do it justice. A person doesn't need a reason to be worn out. Things just pile up on you after a while, and you end up overwhelmed. Of course, this shade of thought doesn't exactly match Kanyasai's color-by-number instructions with perfect precision. It ignores, for example, Chitanda's other festival frivolity, her desire to learn from Irisu the secrets of manipulation. We needn't say much about the fact that Hotaru Oraki was manipulated by Irisu. Most everyone who analyzes anything about Hyouka makes a point of stopping for gas at this particular roadside service station along the KOTENBU highway regardless. It wouldn't do much good to anyone for me to repeat that aspect here. That, of course, being said, why Chitanda looks up to Irisu in the first place is a question I find myself asking more and internet sleuths answering less. Chitanda's bout with attempted manipulation, as Irisu later informs her, is without anything resembling a ripe proverbial fruit. Like a retired tailor, it doesn't suit her now, and it never in the future will.
I want to be clear about this. You aren't really suited for stuff like that.
It's easy to mistake Chitanda's desire to incur devotion to her requests for a want to sell a book, an anthology that the club's members overstocked on accident. That isn't at all why she's doing this, though. Eru Chitanda is trying to find her place and determine her future. She learns from this failure that she isn't suited for a managerial role, and instead should focus on new ideas, solutions to her own curiosity. The final moments of Hyouka confirm it.
I don't think I have the skill set needed to manage a bunch of employees. That was a lesson that I learned during the cultural festival.
In the end, Eru Chitanda feels something for Hotaru Oraki, though nothing of the sort has ever been said aloud by her. Hotaru Oraki feels something for her too, as evidenced by what he says in his head but never out loud in the series' final moments. Fitting that, in the end, a rose-colored confession is a cliché that both Oraki and Hyouka itself avoid. But of course, Hotaru Oraki is already much different at Hyouka's conclusion anyway. He has begun already to be visibly haunted by the regrets he's just now learning that he always had. As a result, whatever happens next will be the steps he takes to let those regrets, his very motto, go. As Hyouka shows us in the Kanyasai arc and follows through with for the rest of the series, Oraki too has found that there are some things in life that he simply has to know. Satoshi Fukabe, the so-called toughest nut to crack among the group, realizes this too. He experiences through Kanyasai an entire arc of jealousy for the potential that his lifelong best friend had simply not used. He expresses in the moonlight disappointment in himself, in who he used to be, reaching for the moon in some attempt to hold on to the past, only to later give an impassioned speech about the weight of expectations, learning through his own emotional outburst that expectations imply that everything is over, and that he knows that as long as he believes in himself, it never truly will be. In the end, when he steals his own chocolates in a vain attempt to escape himself, an attempt by Satoshi Fukabe to do what Hyouka has already told us is impossible, it finally becomes clear exactly what kind of person this fraudulent Isshiki really is. He wants to be the kind of person that doesn't just love with obsessive vanity. Because of course he loves Ibara back. Of course he wants to be with her. He just needs to learn first what it means to let go of his regrets. Once he does, a phone call happens. And in that moment, Hyouka celebrates what it means to leave regrets behind, and live moving forward as the kind of person that you've let yourself become. Satoshi Fukabe, in the end, has discovered that he regrets the life he lived in middle school, and as a result has come to understand that if Ibara and he are ever to work out, if he's ever going to truly love her, that he needs to do it as the version of himself that knows how to leave his regrets in the past.
Hello, Hyouka? It's me. Listen, I really need to talk to you.
Oh, also, there's that entire Mayaka Ibara arc, and I love that. I really do. It's about how manga can be a masterpiece, and it has references all over the place to some real classics, like They Were 11, and it has a school bully who is dressed as Hatsune Miku. Mayaka is a character who understands what she cannot do, and who strives to accomplish it anyway. Mayaka is a character who loves with her whole heart, who loves art and effort, and who, at the start, hates Oreki, because he doesn't have to put in the same level of profound effort that she does, and yet his results often completely outclass her. I know what it's like to stare at your own work, and stare at something else, and understand how far from greatness you truly are. Heck, I look at Bibliomania all the time, and I wish it could be better. I understand how it feels to be angry at someone who can do 6 times the work in half the time, who doesn't even care half as much as you do about the thing you're working on anyway. Someday, in some other review, we can talk about the desire to steal someone else's hands, and what that means. And what it means, perhaps, to learn to be comfortable with your own. In the post-Kanyasai reversion back to everything as it mostly was, we may find occasion to consider ourselves in one of 2 camps. We're either largely relieved that this building tension and its emotional cracks have failed to damage Hyouka's foundation, or we're facing frustration that this group of 4 and their emotionally teetering Jenga tower has yet to be felled. If I grabbed a microphone and said, "Kyou no tenki wa hare hazu da," as the clouds dissipated overhead, people from Japan would think I'm just testing the microphone. People from anywhere else, however, would think I'm predicting the weather. Hotaru Oreki speculates this principle in episode 19, when everything finally becomes clear, like the skies overhead. What Hotaru Oreki perceives as luck, as innate unreliability, Eruchitanda perceives as concrete intelligence and deductive reasoning. Like toddlers playing superpowers, the 2 go back and forth, and as they do, Hotaru Oreki's long-standing motto begins to fall apart. If I don't have to,
I'm not going to.
If I have to, I'll do it as quickly as possible. Except that Hotaru Oreki doesn't really believe that anymore, and neither do I. I'm no longer in the kind of position where minimal effort churns out the best results, like I was in middle and high school. I no longer carry that burdensome weight of self-inhibition and apathetic indulgence. At some point, I realized that the effort I put into my War of the Worlds diorama really did matter, even if I didn't get any higher a grade for creating it. I used to tell myself that when I died, whenever that may be, I wouldn't have any regrets. I could lie to you and tell you that I still feel that way, but I don't. Even as I push forth in the efforts of projects like this one, and any other chunk of debris in the Category 4 hurricane of my creative endeavors, I can't tell myself that regrettable things won't happen, and that I don't wish I could do some things differently if I had the chance. So I thought very hard about what exactly it is that I wanted to do, and all of a sudden I knew exactly what it was. I want to make things that are new, instead of just writing about things that already exist. I want to write a sequel to War of the Worlds. And I want to be proud of my War of the Worlds diorama at the same time. But mostly, I think I just want to be able to have created something for myself. So that's exactly what I did. I'm not writing a novel, but I am working on something creative. Something new and something that functionally could kind of be called a fan-made sequel to an H.G. Wells novel. So if I lied to you and told you that I didn't regret anything and that I'd be happy to die at any time, this entire video couldn't possibly mean anything. It's stupid to say that you've decided not to have regrets anymore. Regrets are gonna happen, no matter what, because mistakes are simply a part of the human experience. The best any of us can possibly do about that is try not to accumulate them, and to learn enough from them that we can smile. even when it hurts. Smile because regret means we know that we messed up, and because that knowledge is proof that we're finally starting to get better. I didn't understand that back then, so I kept my mouth shut. That was stupid. That was the reason I was stuck in a cave, trapped by rubble that I couldn't see. I can now, as an adult, see right through you, Hotaru Oriki. And I think that's why it's so hard for me to watch the show today. Nonetheless, Hyouka got me out. I am a boy drowning in my dreams. And I know now that I can stand up without anybody telling me to. I'm gonna make things, and even as I do, I'm going to continue to critique them, to appreciate them, to play and watch them. Maybe that makes me hypocritical. I don't care. Because this isn't my library, and I'm not writing a novel to put in it. I'm making a video game. Thank you for watching. So, there you have it. In the end, yes, this was just a very long way of explaining why I decided to make The Island of Doctor Morose, and convey to you how much making that game has meant to me. I really, and this is the most important part to mention here, I really don't mind if you play the game yourself or not. And I don't think it matters to me very much if you like it. It matters to me that it was made, though, because now that I have made something of myself that is ultimately original, even if it's loosely based on something by H.G. Wells that already exists, that I can be content doing both that which is original and that which is not. That means the next review I make can be much more of an actual review than this one was. Really, it all boils down to this. Hyouka helped me get through my personal struggles in life, and it showed me how to find what I was looking for. The mystery I solved eventually became intertwined with myself, and like what happens in Hyouka, it taught me things about myself. And I was able to move beyond myself and experience personal growth because that's what watching Hyouka does to people. Hyouka can be an incredibly personal experience, and it can mean a lot to you. I don't think that's something to shy away from, which is why you're watching this right now. I put it back. And really, I think somewhere in there, even if there's still definitely a lot of room for improvement, that what I've created here was at the very least something that was good for me to make, and that all that work meant something. Even if not a lot of people watched it in the end, or even really liked it. And really, that's something I think can be said both for this video and for Hyouka itself.